everyone. But at this time, the clock shows 6 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the City of Tucson Planning Commission. My name is Lexi Wellett, and I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. The responsibilities of this body are to advise the mayor and council and the Planning and Development Services Department on the adoption of long-range plans, policies, specific plans, and regulations that affect land use and development. Will staff please call the roll?
Yes, thank you, Chair Willett. Commissioner Kenny,
Here.
Commissioner Lampo,
Present.
Commissioner Lane,
Present.
Commissioner McCancy,
Here.
Commissioner Martin,
Here.
Commissioner or Vice Chair Ortiz Apino, Commissioner Schwartz,
I'm here.
Commissioner Small,
Present.
Commissioner Walczak,
Here.
Chair Willett,
Present.
Commissioner Young,
Here.
and Commissioner Zagier.
Here.
Let the record reflect that a quorum is in fact present. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strube. At this time, we'll call item number 2, approval of the legal action report for November 13th, 2024. The chair would entertain a motion for the approval of the legal action report.
So moved.
We have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Couple of them. I love it. All those in favor of approving, any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the legal action report for November 13th, 2024, say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Hearing none, motion passes. That brings us on to item number 3. And that is the Community Corridor Tools UDC Code Amendment Study Session. And before we get started on this, I just wanted to take a moment and thank staff for the great work that you guys have done on this project. I personally have attended several of the stakeholder meetings and many of the public outreach events. And I will say there's been a lot of participation, a lot of good feedback received, edits made, and I just wanted to thank staff for the work that they have done on this, because I do believe that this is what is needed in the city, and it is a good effort for moving forward. So with that, would staff please give their presentation for item number 3?
Thank you, Chair Willett. Corinne Manning, Interim Director of Planning and Development Services. We're really excited to present this proposal to Planning Commission this evening. It's been several years in the making, and a lot of work and effort has gone into this proposal, as well as a lot of community input. So we will provide an overview, and we're gonna have several staff present. I'll provide some background, and Elisa Hamblin, our zoning administrator, will walk through some of the technical aspects of the proposal. And Nicholas Martell, our long-range planning section manager, will also provide an overview of the EV charging components of this. And I do want to introduce Nicholas Martell. He has taken on a new role in our department as long-range planning section manager, which includes code development. So he will be participating in planning commission meetings in the future. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So this study session is to present a proposed code amendment to the Unified Development Code, which is the Community Corridors tool. This would create a new section of the Unified Development Code, which would be part of Section 5. So to create a new Section 511. Staff has been working at the direction of Mayor and Council to develop this code amendment as a citywide zoning tool that would enable the redevelopment of underutilized sites along the city's commercial corridors to encourage more housing and mixed-use development. In addition, the tool is focused on aligning the development code with adopted city policies and implementing those policies. This optional tool would allow more walkable, bikeable, and transit-oriented development by right along our corridors, by providing alternate development standards and design requirements. This package also includes a proposed code amendment to amend existing regulations for electric vehicle supply equipment. I want to provide some background on what has gone into this code proposal, sort of where it started and how it has evolved, and some of the phases of research and analysis over the past several years. The Community Corridor tool was initiated by City of Tucson Mayor and Council. Our mayor and council recognize housing affordability as a serious issue facing our community and have directed staff to take action to create tools and strategies to address this issue. One of those opportunities for action, as we're taking a multi-pronged approach to housing affordability in Tucson, is the opportunity to redevelop underutilized sites along our corridors. Seeing this as a major opportunity, mayor and council directed staff to make updates to our zoning code to remove barriers to the redevelopment of those sites, and make it easier to develop underutilized sites with a diversity of housing options. So this direction was given by mayor and council in February and April of 2023. There was actually initially a recommendation from the Commission on Equitable Housing and Development to make changes to our zoning code to make it easier to build housing. And then following that, mayor and council held a study session in April 2023. On tools for the redevelopment of underutilized sites. Then in August of 2023, and this is kind of the phase one of this project, which was more of a research and analysis phase. There was a study session on building and zoning code regulations for tiny homes. So that's another component of this project. Is updating codes to make it easier to build small homes and a diversity of housing types. We also did a focus group to hear more about barriers to development. And then in October of 2023, came back to mayor and council to present some of the research and analysis we did on underutilized sites and where we saw opportunity for redevelopment and some of the potential tools to promote redevelopment. And got feedback and direction from mayor and council to keep moving forward with this project based on a proposed work plan that included further research and analysis as well as outreach and engagement. So from there, we continued to look at some best practices for transit and pedestrian-oriented development, analyze city policies, and adopted plans to look at where there was alignment and support for these tools, and do more detailed site scenario analysis, looking at some of those typical type of sites we see around the city, and looking at different development scenarios and then what zoning tools would be needed to allow that type of desired redevelopment with housing and a mix of uses. Following that, we held 2 public meetings in August of 2024 to share that research and findings and get feedback from the community on these zoning tools. And we'll share more about that community feedback in a moment. We also held a study session with mayor and council in September 2024 to present more of the outcomes from the phase 2 site analysis and further research. And then 2 public meetings in October and November of 2024 to share the proposed zoning tool and get further feedback and input, which has been integrated into the proposal that you see today. And then phase 3 is really what we're beginning now, the formal public review process with input from Planning Commission and public hearings with Planning Commission, as well as in the future with mayor and council. So the goals of this tool are really to make infill development, especially affordable housing, simpler to build along our corridors. We're trying to remove barriers to more attainable and affordable housing, promote transit-oriented infill development that supports our climate action goals, update our zoning to make it easier to permit the full spectrum of housing types, and simplify the redevelopment of underutilized and vacant sites. I mentioned before that this tool really builds on a lot of other adopted city policies and plans. So one of the things we did was try to build on existing policy and really look at how can this tool help implement and move forward a lot of the policies our city has adopted and our community members have adopted and told us are priorities for the community. So one of the first things we did in developing this tool was look at existing plans and policy, including Move Tucson, our transportation plan, the housing affordability strategy for Tucson, the climate resiliency plan, Tucson Resilient Together, the One Water 2100 plan, and of course, Plan Tucson, which is our general plan. These plans, many of these plans had some common themes that we saw as foundational for the Community Corridors tool. Goals around transit-oriented development, both in Move Tucson as well as our climate action plan, goals for diverse housing types in our housing affordability strategy, as well as Plan Tucson and other documents. So we really built on those existing policies, and we're looking in this tool of how to implement these priorities that Tucsonans have been telling us over the past several years. One of the main issues that this proposal is responding to is the need for more housing in our community to address the increased cost of housing and lack of affordable housing. Over the past several years in particular, we've seen rapid rise in housing costs in Tucson, both for rental homes and home ownership. And that's one of the things we're trying to address with this plan. So over the past 12 years, there has been a 180% increase in the purchase price of a home in Tucson. Over the last 9 years, there's been a 98% increase in rents. So our housing development and the amount of housing we're building in Tucson is not keeping pace with the growth and the demand for housing. So one of the things we're trying to do is add to the supply of housing and a diverse set of housing types to create more supply in our community and create more opportunities for homeownership and rental housing. And housing affordability is a complicated issue and of course requires multiple strategies. This is just one of many strategies the city is implementing to address housing costs. So there's a lot of metrics. I think we've all probably seen statistics similar to what we shared, but we also wanted to mention sort of how housing affordability is affecting community members in Tucson on a more personal or household level. One of the things we did in one of the recent surveys related to the Community Corridors tool was ask people, how has the housing crisis affected you? And we got a lot of stories from community members, a few excerpted here, stories about living with roommates, wanting to find a home, but not being able to find affordable housing. One Tucson business owner saying they manage a number of employees whose housing costs impact my ability to pay them a living wage. Wages are not keeping up with the cost of housing in Tucson. Another resident saying my adult son moved home in order to save money to buy a house, but everything is still too expensive. And then the increasing cost of taxes, home insurance and utilities, and increasing costs of general upkeep and maintenance is outpacing our fixed income. So we know that this affordability crisis is affecting Tucsonans across a broad range of incomes and household types. So that's one of the reasons this tool is really looking at how can we promote a diverse range of housing types, from multifamily housing to smaller scale, small lots, single-family homes, and other housing types. Of course, the housing affordability challenges we face in Tucson are not unique to our community, and we see this issue facing major cities and small cities alike across the country. But one of the things we have tried to look at is what are some best practices? What are some cities doing? What are strategies that have actually made a difference and moved the needle in terms of housing affordability? And there is some great research at this point on cities that have implemented zoning reforms to make it easier to build housing. Many of which primarily did focus on corridors, at least as a first step, opening up development and making it easier to build on transit corridors and major corridors. So here's a few examples of communities where zoning reforms have been implemented. And the key finding is really that rent growth is much slower in jurisdictions that have allowed more housing. So rent prices have stabilized and been more contained in those communities with significant zoning reform to promote more housing and a diversity of housing types. In Tucson, of course, this is something we have tried to address through zoning. through a number of different tools in past years. And we've learned a lot from those tools about what has worked and what types of reforms have really moved the needle and made development of housing easier. So in Tucson, some of those zoning tools we have are our downtown infill incentive district, which has been implemented in the downtown area and around the streetcar to allow more transit-oriented development. We've seen a huge amount of development in the downtown and streetcar area, including a large amount of affordable housing that's been developed through the downtown infill incentive district. We also have urban overlay districts, planned area developments, and the individual parking plan, which is a tool to reduce parking requirements. We've also made a number of changes to our code to kind of streamline development of housing through a number of different avenues and changes in the past several years. So we've learned a lot from this, and we've seen that these types of zoning reforms, reducing parking, flexibility when it comes to height and density, have really spurred the development of more housing. What you can see on this map is that most of the multifamily housing developed in the past 10 years has been developed within the infill incentive district or our urban overlay district. So what we see is that those types of tools are really critical to the development of multifamily housing outside of those areas where the zoning has been tailored to allow that type of transit-oriented multifamily and mixed-use development. It's very challenging to build multifamily. The other real avenue and place we see multifamily being built is within planned area developments, where the zoning has been tailored, usually by the developer, to that type of use. So our underlying zoning, our by right zoning, really does not work to build multifamily housing. And we see that there is opportunity for more housing across our community. This is some of the analysis that was done in phase 1 of our research phase, where we did some analysis of where we have underutilized sites, including large parking lots and concentrations of parking, as well as vacant parcels. And we see that our corridors hold a lot of those opportunity sites where we have vacant sites, empty strip malls, big box stores that are no longer in operation. And these sites have the potential for redevelopment along our corridors that can provide more housing and a mix of uses. However, both zoning barriers and some of the financial and economic considerations have been barriers to redevelopment along these sites, which is why we haven't seen a lot of those opportunity sites redeveloped. So more needs to be done to unlock that development potential. Some of those barriers we see with respect to zoning are parking requirements. That's one of the largest barriers that we hear about. Height maximums that limit the height, density and lot coverage regulations, setbacks, split zoning, and discretionary processes. Split zoning refers to sites where we have a mix of commercial and residential zoning, or zoning that might allow commercial uses, but only on a portion of the site, that can create really challenging development scenarios. Discretionary processes could include rezonings, but also design review requirements, or going through an individual parking plan to reduce parking. Of course, zoning is not the only factor and the only reason that we don't see development. The cost of development is a major factor as well. The cost of construction has been increasing over the past several years. We hear this all the time from the development community: the cost of materials as well as labor, soft costs that include consultants and fees, and the cost of land and the scarcity of land are challenges as well. So these are all some of the factors, and what we see is the need to calibrate our zoning to more innovative housing types and the type of housing that is financially feasible to build in Tucson. Which one of the things that we hear and through our analysis and research found is that that low scale multifamily of 2 to 3 stories really does not work financially in Tucson. This is very limiting for nonprofit development and affordable housing development in particular, that has limited amount of subsidy to develop housing. So given these constraints of zoning and market factors, what we do see getting built on our corridors using underlying zoning tends to be more auto-oriented uses. These are the things that currently work with our zoning and the financial considerations in Tucson. We see a lot of auto uses like car washes, fast food, drive-throughs, self-storage. And when we do see multifamily, it's often not a design that is really integrated with the streetscape, not providing a pedestrian-oriented environment. So that is what we see getting built. And what we're trying to do with this tool is provide an alternative and create a zoning framework to allow different type of development. So as I mentioned, one of the pieces of this study was to look at how we would want to take some of those underutilized sites and develop them with multifamily and a mix of housing types. So this is an example of the type of site analysis that we did to look at underutilized parcels. And in this site, this is an existing strip commercial building, looking at how it could be developed with mid-rise mixed-use apartments on an arterial, and then townhomes in the rear. That would be smaller lot townhomes to provide another type of housing. So we looked at a number of scenarios like this to help us develop the type of zoning changes and zoning tools that would be needed to facilitate this type of development that's not currently feasible under our current zoning. Those are the types of analysis we did to develop this tool. And then as well, we shared a lot of those findings with the community through several phases of community engagement. As I mentioned before, we held a series of public meetings in August of this year. At that meeting, we also did a visual preference survey to get feedback from community members on the type of development they would want to see on our corridors and in Tucson, providing a range of options. We also did an online survey of goals, strategies, and concerns, and had an online comment form available. Then we held a second series of meetings in October and November of this year to share the draft of the code changes, the Community Corridors Tool code changes, and got a lot of feedback and input at those meetings as well. We also did an online survey and collected over 150 responses in that survey, and have also been getting emails and comments from community members, all of which has informed the revised draft of the Community Corridors tool that you see. So I want to share some of the common concerns we've heard from the public about this tool. And some of the ways those have been addressed in the code. One is, of course, the impact on neighborhoods. I would say that's one of the biggest concerns we hear, the visual impact as well as parking. And so one of the things I want to highlight is the applicability of this tool, and we'll share a few slides in a moment that really provide some example maps of where this is applicable. So this tool is applicable on corridors and in zones that already allow commercial or multifamily use. That's really what this is geared towards. So there are some cases where R1 zones would be able to use the tool if it is part of a split zone site and with more limited building forms that are allowed in R1. As well, the tool is not eligible on sites that are within some of our urban overlays or any historic preservation zone or neighborhood preservation zone that already have development and design standards that are tailored to those specialized zones or in planned area developments. There's also required transition to any low-scale residential neighborhood, residential zoning through setbacks of buildings as well as step down in height. And again, we'll share a diagram of that a little later on. Another concern or some of the input we're receiving is around design review and suggestions for a design review process. One of the things that we've seen, and as I mentioned before, and kind of talking about what we're seeing today in terms of development, is that right now there are development options that are working, and that's more auto-oriented uses. And one of the things we really want to incentivize is use of the Community Corridors tool. We're trying to create a tool that really advances community goals for housing as well as infill development and more climate resilient development. And we want to make sure that this tool is attractive to property owners and developers and is as easy to use as underlying zoning. So at this point, we're looking to not create any additional steps in the process beyond what underlying zoning currently requires. As well, the code does have a number of standards around building form, open space, and pedestrian areas that we believe are fairly objective standards that we will be able to implement on a very consistent basis across proposed developments. We do hear concerns about existing infrastructure. So want to note that Any development site is analyzed at the time of development for availability of water, sewer, infrastructure, and may require upgrades by a property owner. And as well, though, I would say an overriding goal here is to promote infill development in areas that already have existing infrastructure, water, sewer, as well as transportation infrastructure. So we're really trying to make better use of our existing infrastructure as a city, rather than development, at the edges of our city that do require substantial investments in infrastructure. And then community engagement has been another area of concern and comments that we received. So do really want to highlight that this proposal built heavily on previous outreach and engagement efforts and adopted city policies, but then did also include a number of avenues dedicated to this proposal, a number of avenues for input through 2 rounds of community meetings, as well as multiple online surveys. So I want to share a little bit of what we've heard through our some of the feedback and community input that we've gotten. These are just a few examples of the questions that we asked in the recent survey. You have a full report on this survey in your packet, and it's posted online. One of the questions was, do you support the tool's allowance of a wider range of housing types, such as mid-rise stacked flats, townhouses, duplexes, and tiny homes? So there was 82% in support of the proposal to allow that one of the overriding goals of the proposal, which is to allow a diverse range of housing types on our corridors. Another question was, should the single family homes that front on major streets and routes be allowed to use the tool? Because this is something we've really looked at and weighed. And as I mentioned, this is primarily focused on commercial sites, but our corridors in Tucson have a lot of single family homes. And there was actually quite a bit of support for this. 75% of respondents to the survey did think that single family sites should also be eligible to use the tool. So a lot of people are looking for more opportunities and more flexibility with the tool. And then we asked, what are your biggest concerns with redevelopment of sites along corridors? The top concern that we heard actually was that this doesn't do enough to address affordable housing, which I think shows our community is really looking for solutions on affordable housing. Other concerns were pedestrian amenities, really wanting to make sure that this creates walkable, pedestrian-friendly areas, I think, which is really one of the main goals of this proposal as well. The lack of connection between the site and surrounding neighborhoods, also something this tool seeks to address with requirements to connect to the surrounding street network. Design of buildings not compatible with the neighborhood, and increased urban heat island and parking on local streets were also some of the major concerns. So with that, and we will go through some of those issues in a lot more detail as we go through the details of the code. So again, based on all this feedback, as well as direction from our mayor and council, we have developed a proposed community corridors tool that would allow more housing, a more diverse range of housing types, and promote more transit and pedestrian-oriented development along our corridors, while also creating, we hope, really beautiful spaces and destinations along our corridors that enhance the built environment and quality of life in Tucson overall. So with that, I want to hand it over to Elisa Hamblin, our zoning administrator, who's going to walk through the code in a little more detail and go through each section of the code. And then following the presentation, of course, we will be available for questions.
Good evening, commissioners. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight and talk to you about the Community Corridors tool. So I'm here because I spend time in the code every day, and I spend time looking at developments that come into our community every day. And I'm happy to be able to talk to you about some of the options that are available with this tool and how it's a difference from what exists with our current zoning, and to answer any questions that you might have about how this applies in real life when a project comes to PDSD, to development. So the Community Corridors tool is essentially an optional zoning overlay. We have several of these in our zoning code. Many of you are probably familiar with them. And the community corridors tool would become section 511. It's set up very similarly to a lot of our other sections in the code. But of primary interest for us today as we talk through the different options available are probably sections 2, 5, 6, and 7, as you see on the outline in the screen. So that's where does the tool apply, the applicability, and what can be built and how it can be built, and what other things are required as part of a project. And then lastly, the incentives have also been of a lot of interest, particularly because of the affordable housing incentive. So the tool itself is meant to balance flexibility and predictability and also lean on our underlying zoning where it's appropriate. We're not changing everything in our development standards in what exists in our code, but we're really trying to target the items that, as Corin mentioned, have been problematic or have been difficult in being able to provide the range of housing and development that we're looking for in the community. This map is an example of project or properties that would be eligible to use the overlay. And this is an example of Fort Lowell and First Avenue. It's a simple parcel map. So every box represents a parcel. It's got its zoning indicated on it. And the properties that are in gray would be eligible to use the CCT. So when we talk through this tool, and I'll show you in a few minutes, you'll see a map that shows all the roads that are eligible to use the tool, but really it comes down to being site specific. What zoning exists there and what are the conditions on that property? The tool allows a series of zones that we think are relevant and then appropriate development standards for that zone based on the existing zoning. Generally, R1 and R2 properties are not really given the same flexibility as the other zones. There's limited circumstances when they can be included in a CCT, and I'll walk through those in a project in the CCT, and I'll walk through those in just a minute. But the goal is to really focus development along our corridors where there's zoning that exists that does allow for multifamily commercial development already. Due to a lot of our existing standards like setbacks and parking and lot coverage, density limits and minimum lot sizes, the diversity and the types of housing that we can provide in the community is somewhat limited. Just because it doesn't pencil out, it may not fit because a project can get squeezed from a lot of different angles. A lot of the focus of this code update is to allow a diversity of housing types. Many of the corridors back onto residential areas and residential streets, and we want to respect that by allowing a scale that's appropriate for that location and a transition in housing types. Maintaining the existing R1 zoning, but allowing more diverse housing products and configurations creates a transition overall. You can see some examples on the screen of different housing types, including stacked flats. That includes dwelling units that are on top of each other, maybe have commercial on the ground floor. You see townhomes, which are attached single-family homes essentially, and duplexes. There's a variety of ways to do this really creatively in the community, and we want to do that with this tool. We also want to be able to encourage smaller units and small lot, single family homes. If any of you have worked with our zoning code before, you know that in R1, the minimum lot size is 7,000 square feet. In R2, the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet. The tool would allow for a decreased lot size in order for people to build smaller homes on smaller lots, makes it more affordable because there's less cost in that land purchase. We also want to provide flexibility on those lots to do tiny homes, carriage houses, and other things that we've already seen move forward in the community, such as our ADUs. We want to encourage more units to be developed, but in a way that's compatible with our existing neighborhoods, and that's part of the goal of this as well. We do require transitions in form and scale. This is an example from another community of how you can have different size buildings in different parts of a project or transition based upon the zoning that exists in the location. We do this in the CCT by requiring setbacks and step backs that are related to the zone that's adjacent to the property. We allow the CCT to be used on R1 and R2 sites that are split zoned and other limited circumstances. We allow flexible development standards that encourage transition. We also essentially require buildings to be built up to the corridor itself and not set back behind a sea of parking, which is a condition we see very commonly in the community right now. This is a diagram that illustrates the transitions in form and scale. This is a new addition to the latest version of the draft that went out to be able to illustrate to people that in cases where a project butts up to a less intense zone such as R1 or R2 or O1, there's a step back that's required, meaning you're limited in a certain height within a certain distance of the property line. So again, it's about transitioning scale that's appropriate to that location, but we're hoping that in most instances, the bulk of the height and the density of a building is going to be oriented towards the corridor because we also don't allow parking in between the building and the corridor itself. So by default, a lot of those other things like parking, open spaces, we're going to be in the rear of the building itself. So in correlation with the step backs, will hopefully create that standard. As I mentioned, we're trying to keep higher intensity development to the edges of the neighborhood by requiring sites to have frontage on the street. We're limiting the eligibility of the tool for certain residential zones, and setbacks are based upon the zone that's adjacent to the property. So again, that's similar to how our code functions right now. When you come in and do a development in the community, your setbacks are based upon the zone that's next door to you. We're doing the same thing here with some alteration in those limits and taking out the requirement to have a variable setback based upon the height of the building itself. We're also implementing parking locations and access that's more conducive to a pedestrian environment. So as I mentioned, parking lots would not be allowed between the building and the corridor itself. We're also requiring connections from those parking lots in the form of pedestrian walkways out to the corridor itself, so that if anyone is building a parking lot in the rear, you're going to have a pedestrian walkway that connects you out to the place that we want people to be spending their time. Parking does take up a considerable amount of space on any development currently, and any of you that have done development or just driving around the city will see that we have a lot of empty parking lots. This does increase our urban heat island, and by allowing more flexible public spaces, more landscaping, we're hoping to mitigate that and also create a more pedestrian-friendly environment. In this example, we have a senior living apartment that has significantly less parking than the market rate apartments that are on the right of the screen. We're moving away from one size fits all standards and taking a larger context into consideration. We are still trying to ensure access and available parking, and we're providing some more flexibility with how parking is evaluated. The CCT does have some criteria as to what a proposal would need to include to determine the appropriate amount of parking. So we're taking a look at things like transportation access, transit access, available on-street parking that exists already. If there's housing being developed for low income or senior housing, those are some of the criteria that we'll be looking at to determine the appropriate amount of parking for a project. The parking statement will be provided and explain in those things that I just mentioned. It'll be evaluated based on the proposed uses, and we will do this in conjunction with the transportation department of the city as well. We really want to emphasize that the streetscape itself is the important feature in any development and not just the parking lot. We also have requirements in the CCT for an appropriate size blocks that are very walkable. And this may be a little different than some of the conditions that you're used to seeing. We want to require that the pedestrian is really the emphasis and not just the car itself. Existing streets need to be integrated into the site and connected through. And we're also regulating the block and facade length. We would also regulate access to garages to help minimize conflicts with pedestrians. And as I've already mentioned, we would be requiring buildings to be closer to the street and oriented to the streets. Sorry. The limit in facade length will vary between 160 to 500 feet, depending on the scale of the development. For a frame of reference, and this is a common one that I try to give people because otherwise feet is just like, what does that even mean? If you guys are familiar with Flores Market Run, that facade length of that building along the 6th Street frontage is a little over 200 feet, about 220. And so the facade length, that's a pedestrian scale, very walkable kind of location that a lot of us are familiar with. That's what we're kind of using as a frame of reference for breaking up facades for pedestrian walkthroughs and connections, and the building form that would be built from that. We do require the streets to be extended through the site, and as well as greenways and shared use paths, and encourage existing alleys to be utilized for vehicle access or for utility access and for trash pickup. And again, as I mentioned, mid-block passages will be key to make sure that we're creating a pedestrian scaled environment. Having active and shaded streetscapes are critical to create walkable streets. Having buildings that engage the street and make it easy to walk out the front. We've created this through the standards that we have in place in the CCT and with doors and windows facing out onto the street. In some instances, and I've seen this myself in different locations, communities may require a building to be built to the corner, but then the front door still ends up being off the parking lot. That's not what we're going for. We want it to be really be in all senses oriented towards the street itself. I've already mentioned the facade standards. Active ground floors or on the street are also encouraged. They're not required in all instances because in some cases you'll have residential on the ground floor. We all are also requiring shading that's going to be required to create that healthy and enjoyable pedestrian environment. And as I want to really emphasize, we're also requiring wider sidewalks and more landscaping and dedicated public space, which is not a current requirement of our zoning code. So as a trade-off for some of the standards that we're proposing, we're requiring those other things to be provided as well. The minimum requirement for sidewalks varies in a development between 4 and 5 feet. The minimum in the CCT is 8 feet. And most landscape areas are going to be a minimum of 10 feet. And we've also created options for more tree planting and larger areas for trees to be planted in. We want to encourage resilient and livable places that are enjoyable for everyone, and compact development that enables people to walk, bike, and use transit is more efficient use of our resources. And that's some of the reasons why we've really emphasized the items that we've been talking about, because it contributes to a place that is usable and effective and efficient and well-designed infill development. On pedestrian and amenities, I know this is a focus that's really important to a lot of people. We're requiring trees every 25 feet on center, meaning they have to be, the center of the trunk has to be 25 feet away from the next center of a trunk. This is a increase in our current requirement, and they're also required to have a minimum amount of soil to be able to thrive in. We see that a lot of times that urban trees get very stressed in dense environments. So I've purposely worked with our landscape architect in planning and development services to help figure out some ways to incentivize this infill and balance also the need for greenery, as that's so important in our community. Public spaces will also be required depending on the scope and the scale of the project. Varies like 5% to 10% or a minimum amount of square footage depending on the type of project. Public spaces are intended to be for the community. They can vary. They could be a plaza, they can be a pocket park, they can be partially outdoor dining areas. There's a range of options provided there, and it'll be up to that project to determine what is the most appropriate one for them. But the requirement for the CCT is a certain set size, and they can't be leftover areas in the site either. They really need to be central to the design. So again, we've heard, I think, some comments about please, be specific about where the CCT applies. So I'm going to try to walk through a couple different maps that show you how that works. This up on the screen is a map of the city's major streets and routes. So this is everything that's designated as an arterial or a collector in the community. It's most of the streets that we travel on every single day. But the tool itself is not going to apply to every single property along every single one of these streets, right? Because as we've talked about already, it's based on the existing underlying zoning that's there now and the conditions of that location. For example, this is Fort Lowell and First, and you can see the area that's outlined in the dark dotted line is those are the properties that would be eligible for the CCT. It's based on the underlying zoning, it's based on the use, and it's based on the frontage of whether they have frontage on the corridor. So a really good example is you can see that there are even some residential properties that are facing onto Fort Lowell. They're not eligible because they don't meet the limited criteria we have written for those into the code right now. There's also other properties that are back from the corridor inside of the neighborhood that have R2 or R3 zoning. They're not eligible. It's not going to be in the core of the neighborhood. It's really along the corridor. And I think a common question that I'm very used to hearing is how development works across a site. Sometimes multiple parcels can make up a site. So, and you can also have multiple zones across a site, which gets very complicated. The property that's at the northeast corner of Fort Lowell and First, you can see that's a split zoned parcel that might have at one time been multiple parcels, and maybe that's why the zoning was that way. I don't know. Haven't dug into the history on it. But the CCT allows us some flexibility with that condition where there is both C1 zoning and C2 zoning. You can now develop it in a way where you're doing a cohesive development across the whole entire property instead of limited to just where this zoning boundary is. Sites are considered parcels or a location that have shared site features. So you can have two parcels that are next to each other that are considered a site, and that might be why some of these on the map are included as being eligible, because they really function together even though there's parcel lines or zoning boundaries. It's about how it's used, and we'll be using the current timeline of, where we are right now. If a property is a site right now and they want to develop it with the CCT in the future, they have to demonstrate that they were a site at the time of adoption of the tool. This is another example. This is at Elm in Tucson. So this is showing how limited the applicability can actually be. You'll see there's huge stretches along both of those streets that are not eligible to use the CCT because they don't meet the criteria, the underlying zoning, or they don't meet the eligibility. So there's, in this area that's highlighted, there's properties that are O1, R2, O3, C1, they are included. But then other ones that don't meet the criteria, such as this O3 portion that's kind of to the east of Tucson Boulevard, you'll see in the orange, it's not eligible. It's not part of the same site that fronts onto Tucson. And so therefore it doesn't meet the criteria. So trying to maintain that buffer in between existing neighborhoods and be respectful to that transition in scale. The zoning code outlines typically what uses are permitted and not permitted in a zone. And the CCT does not change the underlying zoning except for in a few limited circumstances for uses that are permitted. Adding in some community serving types of businesses would propose to be included in some of the office zones. So for instance, right now in an office zone, you generally can't have a restaurant or a barber or some other uses that may be appealing to someone that works in an office during the day. You can't do them right now. And so the CCT, when we're talking about mixed use, creating opportunities for people to create, less vehicle trips, trying to allow some of those uses within the overlay. And then also additional housing types, such as townhomes and duplexes and tiny homes in the eligible properties that have that residential zoning that wouldn't normally have those small of types of housing permitted. And then we've also excluded intentionally auto-oriented uses such as car washes and auto repair, just as a couple examples, because we really are trying to emphasize the walkable mixed-use environment that we've been talking about. Okay, dimensional standards. This is where my zoning brain gets real geeked out. From our market analysis, we discovered that 4 to 6 stories is really a sweet spot for development. In reality, our zoning as it exists right now doesn't allow us to do that in a lot of locations. And the heights are very limiting for even multifamily in some of our commercial or office zones. So you'll see on the screen that the eligible zones are highlighted in the table. We have an underlying max height that's in the first row, and the second row has the maximum height in the CCT. There is an increase in the height allowance in this tool, and that's in order to make that feasibility of housing development pencil out. That change in height is in exchange for the community benefits that we've been talking about, such as wide sidewalks, public spaces, parking lots in the rear, step backs on the back of the buildings. All of those things are not currently required. We're asking for them to be required in exchange for the additional height, and hopefully to be able to allow a lot of those projects to be able to come to fruition. There is also a limit on the number of stories of a building. That's not something that the zoning code typically regulates, except for in some of our like overlays or, in a pad might regulate that. In this case, the proposal would have to meet both the height and the number of stories. So it's not one or the other. Somebody's not going to be able to come in with 15-foot high stories and, say suddenly I get all this extra height. No, it's both criteria together. In some circumstances, we're proposing that there's going to be an incentive for additional height, and that would be to provide affordable housing. You would get an additional story of height of 12 feet. For providing mixed use or commercial uses on the ground floor that are active commercial uses. Again, another story of height, and maintaining historic properties or sites. That additional story is permitted on per incentive with a maximum of 6 stories or 75 feet. Once you even tack on your incentives to whatever the zoning is. This is limited to some zones in the CCT. It's not every zone that's eligible to use the incentives. It's really those targeting those kind of middle zoning categories and excluding the ones at the lower end and the ones at the higher end. So we're trying to create more opportunity in that middle category. We're also proposing to have specific requirements for large-scale development. So if something like a mall site or a very large shopping center site was to be redeveloped that had 15 acres, they would need to go through a special process, including a master plan. That includes like a concept plan of how it's all going to be built out over time, a narrative explaining, additional design review can be required, and we would have additional site features that really make sure that those developments are cohesive. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example project so you can kind of visualize how the CCT would work in real life. This is an example of an arterial and a collector. This is a large vacant corner. It's about 7 acres and it has split zoning on it. If we were to develop this under the existing zoning right now, it's pretty likely they would want to put the bulk of the density in just one portion of the site and have a pretty large parking lot on the other portion of the site. And even then, it would be very challenging. A proposed development could include 4 stories of mixed use fronting on the corridor and a mix of parking and house scaled building types on the R1 portion, which is shown in blue. I'll show you a little bit more detail of that in a minute, but the goal is to provide flexibility that there's an appropriate scale in that R1 portion where it's closer to the neighborhood. And instead of that much larger building, it's more spread out. It allows for flexibility in parking and other design features as well. There's a range of housing types shown in this scenario, including stacked flats, or apartments, townhouses, duplexes, small lot, single family, tiny homes, and carriage houses. A project could come in with all of this range of housing options and make it work in a scenario like this. And additionally, we would require that there are standards such as connecting the streets through, creating walkability for not only the residents of that area, but also for the neighborhood nearby, and encourage the use of alleys and maintaining those important connections. We want to make sure that there's a maximum block length, like I mentioned, and building facade length standards that make it pedestrian oriented. And then here is another view, so you could kind of see the scale of what that could look like in real life. The pedestrian amenities, there's open space, there's other things that create this environment, and also a scale that's appropriate in relation to the neighborhood. Height and intensity in the CCT are really encouraged along the corridors with transitions away from there. So I'm going to use a real life example that we've actually seen come into planning and development services for a conversation. This location is the Amazon Motel, which you might be familiar with. Housing and Community Development from the city acquired the site a few years ago and has been working to put affordable housing on it over the last few years. Just to orient you, the cross streets in this location were in between Flowing Wells and Fairview, fronting onto Miracle Mile with Glen to the south. If you're familiar with the large Tucson Police Department complex, it's just to the northwest of this property. The property is zoned C2 and MH1, which is challenging when you have split zoning because the density limits and some of the other things that exist with that underlying zoning create a challenging situation to build. So this is a site plan, and I know site plans are sometimes hard to read, so I'm going to try to orient y'all, make it clear. Miracle Mile is on the left of the screen, so that's the north side. The existing Amazon Motel is at the top of the screen. HCD is working and is close to completion on those units that are in the Amazon Motel. There's 30 units there that are converting from prior hotel space. And then the proposal would be to add a new building on the vacant portion of the site. So the new building is the dark gray. Under the underlying zoning, there's a density limit on this and also a height limit that really constrain that building. There is in this scenario and in the other option I'll show you in a second, still an open space buffer to the south where the MH1 split zoning is. So part of the reason to orient the building this way using the underlying zoning is not being able to use the MH1 for much density at all because it's very constraining on the amount of units you can put in there. This from this view doesn't look significantly different than the last view, but what you're actually seeing on the screen is a step back in the building and how it could be built. So that new building that's on the bottom of the screen that's in the dark gray has a 6-story version or 6-story portion and a 3-story portion. So because of the step back requirements of the CCT, but it allows much more density in this location. This is again, just a concept. This is not HCD's fully conceptualized plan at this point. They came in for a pre-application meeting with the city, with our department last week. And so we've been talking through what they potentially could do with the CCT. This is a comparison between their two different options. The total units on the site could go from 60, which would be under the base zoning, to 124 using the CCT. That's just a potential, again, not their proposal necessarily, but looking at the constraints of building typology as well as height in zoning and where you need to put your setbacks and everything. You essentially could almost double the amount of units that are on this site with the CCT. They could have potentially up to 84 units in the new building. HCD thinks that they'll probably more likely try to go with around 60 in a new building just because of funding and how those mechanisms work, but potentially could add that many. The height limits I've also put up on the screen for you. In the underlying zoning, C2 is limited to 40 feet and MH1 is limited to 25 feet. And in the CCT, the C2 would be 60 feet, plus they would be eligible for a 12-foot incentive for providing affordable housing. So they could go up to 72. And in the MH1, they could have up to 37 feet with 25 feet and 12-foot incentive. And in both of these scenarios, I'll highlight there is still a significant 40+ feet of open space in the rear of the building to the MH1 zoning. And in the CCT option, there's a step back that also occurs with the building scale. So really pushing the orientation towards Miracle Mile itself and allowing the creation of more units, and also the flexibility with parking requirements and some of the other things make this feasible to be penciled out more likely than under the underlying zoning. So I wanted to provide that as a real life example. It's been really interesting for me to be able to see that conceptually as we talk through the CCT and what it could look like in real life. And hopefully as HCD works towards providing more affordable housing units, they'll be able to find an option that works for them as we work for the community. That concludes my presentation on the CCT, and I'll turn it back over to Corin.
Okay. I think we just had one more slide perhaps in summary. Yeah, so just to summarize, the goals of this tool are to foster more transit-oriented and pedestrian-oriented development, to allow a broader range of housing units and more housing on what we think are one of the primary opportunities and an area that can support more housing in our community, which is our corridors. At the same time, transform our corridors into more livable spaces with more open space and greater walkability. That concludes our presentation on the community corridors tool. There is one more component of this code package, which is some changes to our EV parking requirements. So I'm going to ask Nicholas to provide an overview of those proposed changes.
Good evening, commissioners. Happy to be here to talk about electric vehicle charging, what's happened in the past with electric vehicle charging, and then some of the proposals going forward. So just to do a quick overview of what's happened, there was a review of EV charging regulations right now. On August 23rd, 2022, Mayor and Council approved an amendment to the Unified Development Code to ensure new commercial development in Tucson is EV ready. Regulations, which were effective December 1st, 2022, they required all new commercial development, multifamily office, and retail to include EV stations or outlets, as well as conduit to support future expansion of EV capacity. At adoption, Mayor and Council asked staff to monitor the implementation of the new regulations and report back to ensure the regulations are achieving the intent set forth during adoption. And so we're here doing that right now and talking about moving forward. So mayor and council directed staff for the code adjustments to be incorporated into the community corridors tool code package. So just to review what's happened so far, PDSD collected feedback on development standards through the review of submitted development packages, different projects that had to do electric vehicle charging, and a survey to accurately assess the amendment's effectiveness and capture broader community goals relative to EV charging. The survey was sent to a broad range of stakeholders, including the public, development community, and previous participants of the EV code amendment process. Some of the survey feedback were generally felt that the code was working, with positive feedback on the benefits to overall climate goals for the city, providing an amenity for customers, and then residential EV charging standards. We identified some situations where we need to balance competing goals, including cost versus community benefit. We also identified the need to allow for flexibility in the application standards, such as parking reductions and site expansions. One glaring example of this, you may have heard, the Loft Cinema expansion. So their proposal when they submitted their development package was the construction of a 5,000 plus square foot structure that connected the two buildings. There was no increase in the number of parking spaces proposed. Their site already had enough parking as it was. And so that expansion triggered EV compliant requirements, although no new parking was actually proposed for the site. So they would have been required to do 8 new EV charging stations, and in addition to the existing 4 that were already there. At their September 11, 2024 study session, Mayor and Council provided direction for staff to address the following. To revise the requirements for the site expansions to clarify that EV requirements apply to only to new developed parking areas. In the case of expansions, the current code said provided parking. I'm sorry, it said parking instead of provided parking. Establish a path to reduce EV requirements when less parking is provided than required by code through approved reductions. A public meeting was held and proposed EV charging code changes on November 21st, 2024. So the proposed code changes are as follows. These are changes to the Unified Development Code that are proposed to meet the direction provided by Mayor and Council. Amend the existing standards to base the number of required EV SE parking. That's supply, yeah. Spaces on the total amount of parking provided after any approved reduction. So provided being the key word there. And then adjust requirements for expansion of existing sites to ensure that EVSC standards apply only to the additional parking provided as a result of the expansion. And also to clarify the language for ADA compliant EV charging spaces. The staff recommendation, the staff recommends that the Planning Commission set the Community Corridors Tool and EV charging UDC amendment for a public hearing coming up January 15th, 2025.
Thank you, Ms. Manning, Mr. Martell, and Ms. Hamblin for all of your presentations this evening. I think it's certainly been helpful from my perspective, and I hope the rest of the commission feels the same. But at this time, I'd like to open it up for any questions for staff related to both the community corridor tools as well as the EV charging requirement changes. So floor is ours to talk. So Commissioner McCancy, feel free to start us.
Thank you. I have several questions. One of them should be pretty easy. Could you distinguish for me, a newbie at all this kind of stuff, an arterial, a connector, and a corridor?
Chair Willett and Commissioner McCansky. So currently, the city has a plan and a map called the Major Streets and Routes Plan. And this was originally adopted, I think, in the 80s. It's been amended a couple times. But the Major Streets and Routes Plan essentially identifies arterials and collectors in the city. And the distinction between those is really in their size and scale. So I'll give you an example of a couple streets. Speedway would be an arterial. A collector would be Fifth Street.
Would be
So
what, Fifth?
Fifth, yeah. And when you think about those two streets, they run parallel to each other, but they're pretty different in their scale. It has to do with the amount of traffic volume that they can handle and also how they're designed, how the signals are put in, all of those kinds of things. A corridor, we've been using that term pretty regularly as we talk about this zoning code amendment. A corridor is essentially going to be anything that's designated on the city's major street and routes plan. And knowing that that map can change over time as transportation updates it or amends it, we didn't want to call out specific streets, but really leave it to how transportation identifies those streets. So corridor, in my mind, is a much more approachable term for people than an arterial or collector or a major street and route. But essentially they're synonymous. But the corridor terminology is meant to really help us distinguish this tool and how it's used.
Is Speedway a corridor?
So Speedway would be a corridor because it is designated on the city's major streets and
Okay,
routes
is,
plan.
just two streets that I know well. Is Mountain one of those? What is Mountain?
You've stumped me. I don't know that off the top of my head. Um,
And what is Glen? Because those are
Glen
two
is like-
streets that are kind of busy, but not really.
I
And they kind
believe-
of have commercial stuff and they kind of don't.
I think both Mountain and Glen are collectors.
Collectors. Okay, thank you. Second question. In the actual code document that we got, it said something about Tucson having the highest housing percentage increases compared to the other Arizona metro areas, which I found very interesting and was wondering if there was any explanation for that that might be germane to this discussion.
Commissioner McCansey, I would have to look at exactly the source, but that does line up with what we understand about Tucson's housing costs in the last 5 years, particularly since the pandemic, when we had an influx of new residents. And I think it's really because Tucson's rents and our housing market was a bit lower than a lot of other major cities like Phoenix and Flagstaff, because our housing market was very slow to recover from the 2008 housing crisis. I believe that's why Tucson experienced such a rapid increase in the last 5 years compared to other cities.
So they're starting from a lower base. Okay, well, that makes sense. And then, yeah, so I was just curious, like another development that I'm familiar with because I'm down there all the time on my bike is the Mercado district. I'm just curious if that is a good model for some of the things we're discussing here. And this is for me, just my own understanding of where all this is going and what we're supposed to be voting on.
Sure. Commissioner McKenzie, I think that's a great example to bring up because that is a transit-oriented development that is built around the streetcar and also I think includes a lot of great strategies to promote walkability and different mobility options with very wide sidewalks, buildings that really front on the street and the sidewalk, design standards and a design approach for that district. And that was developed through a planned area development, which we mentioned earlier is one of the tools that we see actually works for housing development, but takes a very tailored approach and requires quite a bit of legwork on the part of the developer. So that's exactly the type of model and type of development that this tool would encourage is more transit and pedestrian oriented development that creates more walkable communities and a mix of uses, which is another important point about the Mercado district, that it integrates commercial uses along with housing and different scales of development.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McCansey. I'm going to jump online real quick, and then we'll come back. So Commissioner Zagier, you're up. I see your hand raised.
Thank you. I was thinking along the same lines as Commissioner McKenzie is, I was trying to figure out the city's major street and route plan. Um, uh, Not that easy to find. I'm just not that familiar. But, they have arterial streets, scenic arterial streets, gateway arterials, collectors, gateway collectors, future collector street, and there's no mention of corridor. Um, so, maybe, as far as, definition in this particular thing, it might be better to actually list those, to somewhere in the CCT as a definitely define them. So that, developers, homeowners, other people know that, what is actually, I think people are more concerned about whether it's, um, a collector or would be a smaller street with housing along it. Everybody's pretty familiar with the major streets, but the middle streets is, and then there's middle streets that may be considered a collector. Are there, we're on a mile square, so the half-mile streets, are those the collector streets? Or are there maybe something in between that could be considered a collector street? Or can anything be considered a collector street? Does it depend on whether it has striping going down the center of it? Does it have the white striping going along the sides? Um, um, as far as development questions goes, is having, if you're looking at this for development, I think that something like that needs to be defined a little bit better. Um, uh, and, that was just, I don't know if there's any way to define that or have it attached, um, more to the CCT.
Thanks, Commissioner Zajir. As I understand and as I've looked over the material, there is a definition as to what corridor means, and it is directly connected to the adopted major streets and routes. So if I'm off base, please correct me in that. But I think what might be helpful is, we mentioned the major streets and routes. Would it be possible in an electronic version to throw a hyperlink into the code that would allow for, when we talk about the major streets and routes, you can click on that and maybe that will directly take you to this applicable map. And so if it does ever get updated, yes, it's a little bit of, legwork on us or housekeeping that we would have to keep in mind to update that hyperlink, but that would at least plug people in directly to the resources that they may need. And I think that's some of what Commissioner Zajir is getting at here. We're gonna go back. I see your hand up, Commissioner Lampo, but there's a couple hands here in person, so I'm gonna take one in person and then I'll come back to you. So just hang tight there. Commissioner Martin, I believe you had your hand up next.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I think my comments go to predictability and protection of the neighborhoods. I want to thank staff for incorporating some of my first red lines. I'm going to go back to some of the ones that weren't incorporated. On page 5, number 7, talks about adjacent to the corridor. I think need to be careful using adjacent because there's a definition in the code. I think abutting or adjoining is a better word in those cases. Our C5 on the same page, it says new parking areas to be better designed. I think that's awkward and vague. I think I always look at what's the intent of the code. Do the words convey the intent? Are there unintended consequences? What's better designed to me might not be better designed to somebody else. And number 10, it said administrative modifications to allow integration of best design practices. What is that? That's not defined. I'm just gonna go page by page because it's easier. On page 6C, the word adjacent is used. It says
Speak
about,
out into the microphone, please.
no? Number 1C, well, actually, in number 1, the way it's written, R1 and R2 sites can be used, are eligible if they front a major street and are underdeveloped. It's an or, all those say or. So number 3 is an or, so that means that contradicts what you're saying about R1 and R2 being eligible for the CCT. So, you know, it looks like the R2 on your picture on page 7 would be eligible because they front the major corridor or the collector, and then if they're undeveloped. I wasn't sure what the A's are on the R2. There's a black circle with an A. What those are intended to do. And number 2, it says with authorization from the zoning administrator. I know that's a process for interpretation. Do neighbors get noticed? I know that they are able to be noticed of the decision within 400 feet and neighborhood associations within a mile. But will they get noticed that there's an interpretation being applied for? I think they should be. On page 8, number 1 and number 2, I have no idea what those mean. A use is permitted in a use which is permitted in the majority of a non-residential zoned area of any site may be permitted across the entirety of the non-residential zoned area of the site. That seems to be a circle of, a word circle. On page 9, looks like the pre-application conference will require a lot of material and that the review will be much more thorough than any other pre-application conferences that we go through, because you're determining whether or not the application meets a lot of criteria. So I think applicants need to know that it's not just a easy site plan, and staff needs to actually provide detailed comments more than normally happens these days. On page 10, there's the zoning administrator process again. Is there notice for that? Page 12, there's not predictability if the city engineer can change the width of the right-of-way. And what's the process for that? Is it a modification? It says a variation. As to protecting the neighborhoods, I think the areas that are adjacent to R1 and R2 need to meet the standards of the solar access, which is about 0.75. The setback is 0.75 feet versus the height. So I think the minimum setback from residential needs to be 20 feet. There will be a landscape buffer yard intent of it because it's a non-residential use adjacent to residential or a parking lot next to residential. So on all the tables, I think the adjacent to R1, R2 needs to be 20 feet minimum. On your step backs, I think those are woefully inadequate. If you use the 0.75 ratio, I think it comes out to 35 feet for buildings that are 50 feet tall. If you start with 20 feet for 2 stories, which would normally be 18.75 feet under the current code. So I think you need to protect the neighborhoods with what's under the current code. The 80 feet looks okay. There's nothing in here for the 140 feet, which would be 100-foot setback. And then there's nothing in for the 300-foot allowable in OCR 2, I think it is. So I think that's 210-foot setback. So there's some information missing there. And this pertains to section 7.3, solar access in the UDC. I think that needs to be maintained. Under connectivity on page 19, it says that public streets shall be extended through the site. Even on your example, there was like a standard street, and then the street that went through the site was an alley or a parkway. So I think the shall is keeps from having it doesn't allow design of the site maybe in ways that other ways to look at the site design. On page 20, I have a problem with the use of the new street from the Department of Transportation guidelines. They are in residential streets, it causes increased right-of-way width, so I think it's contradictory to what you're trying to do. Page 21, under number D, it says preferences will be given to designs which prioritize a safe and enjoyable experience for pedestrians. What is that? I think that's another predictability issue. Under G on page 24, it looks like you're basically doing an IPP without neighborhood notice. Maybe that's the intent, but on page 26, the minimum lot or the minimum height of the masonry wall for the screening says 29 inches. The landscape code requires 30 inches. You're going to change it, make it 28, so at least it's block. It's 4-inch increments. Under access, under B, I think there should be a link to where the access standard is. It just says shall not exceed the maximum allowed width, but there's no reference to where to find what that is. Have concern on page 27, 2. It says single family has to be accessed from alleys only. I think in some townhouse designs, you're going to have streets, not alleys, and I think that's limiting. On the table, 511 6-2, the perimeter yard adjacent to a residential zone should be 10 feet since you have to have a landscape border. Under the two-way entrance for parking, 20 feet is too narrow. It's just trying to get 2 cars in a 20-foot drive if somebody's waiting to get out. It's practical. Under page 29, large-scale development, I think it should be the lot area for master plan should be smaller acreage. I'd say 5 acres or larger, and 6 stories or more, because the zoning, I think in C3 is 5 stories, and then it jumps, or 2 is 5 stories, and it jumps to 7 stories. So, and then this part of the code, it has 7 or it has 8, and the executive summary it says 7. So there's conflict there. On page 31, modification interpretations. Number 1, it gives staff, which it it just says it can be modified if there's conflicts. It has no amount. I think that's goes to predictability, and it seems like zoning administrator should look at that. Number 2, it says design solution consistent with enhanced pedestrian environment. What is that? Doesn't seem predictable. Number 4 says that parking can be adjusted to allow for economic feasibility. I think that doesn't give you any predictability there. And then lastly, number G, street. There's already a definition of street in the definitions. Does this supersede the existing definition, or is this in addition to the existing definition? Because that definition talks about what a street is right away. So those are my comments. In general, I don't think, well, I think this is pretty complex. Not a lot of time to review it. My major concern is protection of existing neighbors, and then having the predictability that you say you want. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Martin. Appreciate your comments there. Commissioner Lampo, we're jumping back to you online here. You're up.
Hi, thanks. So great presentation, very clear. So thanks, Corin and Alyssa. I actually, building off of Chuck's last comment, I would agree. This is a very complex ordinance that we're looking at. Only having one study session to very quickly look through it and make recommendations is pretty difficult. Is there any possibility that we could schedule a second study session for this?
Well, that's open to discussion with amongst the rest of the commission, Commissioner Lampo.
Great. We should talk about that. I had a few questions. So the word bonus was removed from 5.11.7. I was just curious why that happened, and I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about which bonuses you might have explored, which incentives, which development density bonuses. So some that came to mind, just tuck under parking, location from public transit lines with high ridership. So I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about the thought process behind that.
Thank you, Commissioner Lampo, for those questions. The word bonus was removed just for clarification because the 3 incentives that are listed as incentives and not bonuses. So that's the reason for it being removed. We really targeted those 3 incentives because they were trying to achieve goals that we've heard over and over as being a priority for the community, being affordable housing, mixed use, walkable environments, and preservation of historic resources. We feel that the CCT, I think in a lot of instances, addresses some of the other design bonuses maybe that you might see in other situations, but we've tried to provide flexibility on a lot of the development standards that you might see in other communities where they have a bonus for something. So that's kind of the short answer for it, but certainly the commission can discuss that further if there's other things they'd like to see.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes sense to me. You talk about tuck under parking, but then it's not, given a designation in that section. The other thing that I noticed is in your presentation, you had a slide that showed, I think, 80% solar reflectivity, and you mentioned urban heat island effect and a few other things, but there's nothing along those lines in the draft that we have in front of us. So I've asked this question a few times. The only land use in the in the UDC that actually requires an albedo for a new structure. An albedo reading for a new structure is an ADU. I just think this is a perfect opportunity to discuss that a little bit further and maybe some other standards from the ICC Green Construction Code. So I was just wondering if you could clarify that as well.
That's certainly something that could be included if that's the desire of the commission. I haven't myself been privy to those prior conversations about the albedo level, but that's something we could look into if you'd like us to.
Well, yeah, I think you should.
Okay.
And so the only, and Chuck mentioned a few, Commissioner Martin mentioned a few, that I very much agree with the one, and I can't remember which section, talking about one or two space garages, access through alleys. I think that is a good idea. I think about, we're on major streets where the speed limit might be 35 or 40, but in reality, people are going 65. So flooring it and then hoping that you make it into your one-car garage. I always think about Broadway and Columbus. There are those two newer construction houses, and one of them has their access point on Broadway, and I just wonder how much fun that must be getting into that driveway day in and day out. So just that was the only point of contention. Everything else that he mentioned, I agree with. That actually is all of my questions. I just would say I think we need to see this again in another study session. I think it's just we're all working professionals. I can't remember how many pages. It's a very lengthy, very dense document that we only had a few days to look at. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner Lampo. We'll go with Commissioner Small here. I saw his hand first, and then we'll work down the line.
First off, I'd like to commend the staff for a really thorough presentation and good images of what this can look like if it is perfectly executed. I also agree with Commissioner Martin and Commissioner Lampo. It's a lot of information to take in a short period of time, and especially Commissioner Martin and his comprehensive review of the specific points that I think had a lot of validity. As someone who spent most of my adult and professional career in a city that did this, Portland, Oregon, I'd say that the Portland, Oregon of 1990 is not unlike Tucson of 2024, when this was just starting out, and they've done it and done it for 30 years now. I think one of the major problems that happened there was, and I'll get to parking, is that I think parking is a very critical component of this kind of development, because they tried to limit parking in order to emphasize public transportation and bike transportation, which, as we all know, most households come with at least one and generally two cars. So they underprovided parking for a lot of these developments, which led to parking bleeding out into adjacent neighborhoods. When there were restaurants included in these neighborhoods, people would circle the neighborhoods for 20 minutes trying to find a parking spot in the neighborhood, and that affected the adjacent residential neighborhoods. And I think that was a negative to this type of development. So I think obviously parking is important, because as much as we'd like to say that everybody will start taking public transportation and riding their bikes, that doesn't necessarily happen. So that's my comment on that. Regarding the EV requirements, now are the EV additions, are those public EV stations or private to the development? And the reason I ask that is because I've got a daughter who just drove over from Los Angeles for Thanksgiving with an EV car. And right before she had to head back to Los Angeles, needed to charge and was having a heck of a time finding a public EV a charging station in town. We went over to Himmel Park and both of the cords had been cut, for instance. So is that a private to the development or public EV parking?
Commissioner Small, it could be a mix. So I would say, there's no requirements on how accessible to the public. These requirements apply to multifamily as well as commercial and office uses. So I would say what we see is often the multifamily or the office, it might be private to those residents or employees. But most commercial settings, it is geared towards customers, but typically open to the public.
Thank you.
Oh, Commissioner Kinney, Commissioner Lane, we'll come back to you. I just want to work through the line first. So why don't we start with Kylie and then we'll work our way back and then down the other way. So Commissioner Walzak, you're up.
Okay, well, I got a little overwhelmed by the amount of Chuck's comments, but one thing that did stick out to me was about your comment about the IPP, and you noticed there was no neighborhood notice in this proposal. Is that right?
That's correct. The current proposal is there would be no neighborhood notice for the parking statement or use of the tool.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I find that that's an appropriate thing to include in your draft tool, because as a neighborhood president, we receive all kinds of IPP requests and notices all the time. We're in favor of all of them because as long as they are located along a transit corridor, we see no reason to oppose an IPP plan where a developer has proposed the amount of parking that they think is reasonable, especially given all of the available transit that's available in the area.
Commissioner Walzak, can I piggyback? Because I have an exact point to that, just
Sure.
real quick. I agree, and I echo that sentiment, that I think it is appropriate to not have a neighborhood meeting involved in that process. And that it's something that the town of Marana does currently. They created a parking justification analysis or parking justification report. Can't remember exactly what it was, and they've been exercising that for several years now, and it has proven to not be problematic, and that business owners don't want to provide not enough parking for what they need. Developers don't want to provide not enough parking, and so there's that fine balance. And I think along a corridor, and especially the type of development that we are trying to achieve by result of these tools, it lends to that flexibility of parking. So I too agree with that statement.
I was curious, I had one other question about, in the survey summary that you provided, I was struck by the response rate to should single-family homes that front major streets and routes be allowed to use the tool. So currently, you're not proposing that they can. Do the results of this survey change anything? And can you explain or give us some scenarios of what that might look like?
I'll offer some clarification, Commissioner Walzak. So Commissioner Martin mentioned this as well. So R1 and R2 properties are eligible to use the tool if they are part of a site that is split zoned. So meaning like if there's a property that has C1 on part of it and R1 on the other part of it, it's eligible. Also eligible if they are a parcel that's on the corridor and it's been sandwiched between zones that are eligible. So if a single R1 property had C2 on one side of it and O1 on the other side of it, it would be eligible. It's sandwiched in between these other eligible zones. And so we're trying to create cohesiveness along that frontage. And then the other scenario is if there is a vacant R1 or R2 that fronts onto the corridor, they would be eligible. So when we were talking through the presentation, we talked really about the split zoning and just mentioned there's other limited circumstances. Those are the other limited circumstances that we would think it's appropriate to include that R1 and R2 zoning is in those very specific circumstances where, you know, they're the cream in the Oreo cookie scenario. And then also when they're a vacant property as of the adoption date. So really trying to keep the tool from removing existing neighborhoods that might front onto a corridor and really just target it to the ones that it's the most appropriate use of it.
Okay, that helps. So just to make a local example of the neighborhood that I represent, West Congress, west of Grande, in the Menlo Park neighborhood, there's a whole row of historic bungalows. We're not a historic protected zone or a neighborhood preservation zone, but we are a historic contributing neighborhood. There's a whole bunch of bungalows all in a row. They couldn't decide to sell and to a developer who could then put up a 4 or 6 story apartment building in their lots if they were not split, sandwiched, or next to vacant lots.
If they were not split, sandwiched, or a vacant lot as of like the date that it gets adopted. So in that scenario, as long as they have the zoning of R1 or R2 and meet those, you know, other exceptions. So, yeah. And again, we did hear during the community feedback that the tool should not encroach into existing neighborhoods and it should not remove existing housing. So that's, you know, single family established neighborhoods. So that's the rationale for those limited circumstances. So the situation that you describe, if there's a row of 4 houses, as long as they're not zoned like, you know, C3 or something, you know, as long as they have that R1, R2 designation, then they would not be eligible in that scenario.
Okay. Last question. I've heard a lot of people say the same thing about this being a lot of information, there being a short timeline to review it at the commission level. I am curious about the city's housing project, and maybe we could ask them what, I know timelines are tight for these kinds of projects. This is an actual project that they're actually pursuing funding for, is that right?
Yeah, it's a project that is actually underway. They've done the first phase of it already, so 2 phases. The Amazon Motel site that I showed in the presentation, they're actively working with an architect to design the second phase. We do have a representative from Housing and Community Development here in the audience, Sarah Megason. She can answer some more specifics on that if you don't mind her coming up to the mic.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Sarah Megason. I am the Housing Development Manager in our Housing and Community Development Department. The example you showed is one of 8 development projects that we have in our pipeline. All of them are on corridors. It's sort of where we can build affordable housing. Low-income housing tax credits, which is the primary tool to use to build affordable housing, is a tight timeline project. Every year, projects are allowed to submit an application. It's a competitive process to be awarded the funding. Those applications are due April 1st every year. And so we were really excited for this project to be able to get to that sweet spot of 60 or so units to help develop the project, which we can't get using base zoning. It would maybe require us to go through a rezoning, which is even longer. So this tool, for us, we're really hoping that we can utilize the tool when we submit an application in April. I'm not trying to push any timelines, but I do want to stress that if we really want to build affordable housing, we have to understand that there are strict parameters with which we have to kind of play that game, the affordable housing game. And so we're constantly held to very, very strict timelines. And just as an example, Milagro on Oracle, we just got some temporary certificate of occupancies today. We started that project just a little over a year ago, and we're already going to be complete and moving people in by the end of the year. So these affordable housing projects get applied for really quick every year in April. And then we're putting them online, placed in service for people to move in with them within a 1.5-year time frame of constructions. So for us, this tool would be really beneficial if we could utilize it for Amazon and all of our other projects that we have kind of lined up in the pipeline, which are on corridors, split zoned. And so all of the work that's gone into this, HCD's help to inform it with example projects as well. So that's our timeline for all of the low-income housing tax credit projects. They'll all be applied for April 1st.
So to answer your question, yes, there is some time sensitivity. And I mean, just, we know as, just in the space that we are all in, time is money and money is time, right? And so often, I think there are a lot of projects come on board where zoning becomes a challenge, where you would have housing or something, or if they just had 10 extra feet or whatever the case may be, we would be solving a much larger project. But instead, people look at rezoning as a barrier and they leave, they skip town. And that's why we are in the deficit that we are. And that's why it is important for these types of tools to go in. So thank you for those questions, Commissioner Walzak.
I think having a study session continue till next month still allows time to get this approved before Sarah needs it, because the commission can meet 2 weeks after that at a public hearing. So I don't think the timeline is that critical right now.
Well, and I think it's important to remember that there is public hearings and a number of other avenues for us to participate in. And so, we could all, some of us may have done our homework sooner, maybe some of us didn't. And that's where we're kind of at this point. But personally, having been involved in this process for the last year and a half, from a personal interest as well as an interest on this body as to how we look at this and what spaces mean in this community, we are far behind where we need to be. And the only way we can get there is by acting sooner in a time of which where costs are certain today, where tomorrow they won't be certain. And so I think we've gotta play this out a little bit more, and I'll save the rest of what I'm gonna say until we get to my point here. But Commissioner Lane, please.
Thank you. I am going to start by picking up where Kylie left off a little bit and asking if there are, if the city has retained enough flexibility to make exceptions for sites that maybe don't perfectly meet your current definition of an applicable site, so that, I don't know, I was thinking about an R1 or 2 corner lot that couldn't maybe be said that it was sandwiched, but also maybe had a dilapidated building that could be torn down. Is there flexibility for you to be able to make exceptions or make value sort of judgments?
Yeah, Commissioner Lane, thank you for the question. We get very commonly, it's, what about this situation? Would it apply here or not? And so I appreciate the flexibility question. We've tried to be very specific to provide that predictability of where the tool is eligible. There is currently in the draft an option for a zoning examiner special exception for projects that maybe don't meet those strict parameters, excuse me. And so that would be an additional way to bring in some of those unusual circumstances if they're not one of the ones that we've kind of outlined in the draft already. So the goal with that would be to make sure that there is adequate notice for the ones that don't, adequate notice and process for those ones that don't meet the predictability that we've outlined.
Okay, and that, I'm sorry, could you repeat the section? Would
Sure.
that add time?
It would add time. It's in section 511 C3. And so a special exception for anyone that's not familiar with that goes through there's 3 different options for a special exception. It can go either to the director of planning and development services, it could go to the zoning examiner, or it could go to the mayor and council. So there's different types of special exceptions based upon the proposal, the type of proposal, and that exists in our code right now. That option in other places, it sometimes is called a conditional use permit, is a very common term. In the draft right now, we have it listed as a zoning examiner special exception process. So it does require public notice. It requires mailings. There would be meetings. It would add a little bit of extra time, but again, it would be in those circumstances that don't fit into what we've tried to capture here of what I think is probably 95% of the cases where we think it's appropriate. And there's probably those 5% of cases where they want to, go outside of those bounds a bit.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna try to be cohesive. My notes are all over the place. So the first thing, you, in one of your images on the corner of First and Fort Lowell, included a P-zoned lot within the boundary that you defined as a CCT area, but you didn't mention P-zoning in the language of the text. So are P-zones open for this development?
Thank you for the question. So that's again in section 511(2), and there is a call out for basically a determination by the zoning administrator. Certain zones can be included: MH1, MH2, P, which stands for parking, PI, which is park industrial, and I1, if they're part of an existing split zoned property. Or they have frontage on a corridor and adjacent sites also fronting are CCT eligible. So again, the Oreo cookie example. So it's a determination request to include those. And then we've also included language of what standards apply in that zone. So for instance, if the HCD example that I pulled up on the screen had a split zone property of MH1 and C2. Normally, MH1 would not be eligible for the CCT, but in this scenario, it would be because it's part of a split zoned property. And the standards that apply to the MH1 are the same as the R1. So we made sure that there's a relationship between those most relevant zones, so you know how to look at it. So that language is in the draft.
And does that add extra time?
If someone was requesting a zoning administrator determination, that's a very minor amount of extra time. It's a letter request. Typically, it's about 20 days.
Okay, and then just to clarify, the example again that you showed on First and Fort Lowell, I couldn't tell if it looked like a separate lot behind another that was facing the street. So it didn't appear to be a mixed zone, but rather it was behind and adjacent to.
It's likely that it's part of the same site because again, multiple parcels can make up a site. It's based on how it's developed existing today. So I'll give an example of if anybody knows the shopping center that's at Kolb and Broadway that's on the south west corner where Gaslight Theater is. That shopping center you would think is just one big parcel and one big property owner. It has like 20 parcels running across it. It's kind of crazy when you look at it, but we consider that all one site because it functions all together, right? Like they share access, they share parking, they share pedestrian circulation, all of those things. That's how the differentiation between a site and between a parcel.
Okay.
So in that example, I don't know off the top of my head without looking at it, but it's likely because it is the same site right now. There's maybe, they have two parcels that make it up. Maybe it's for financial reasons. Maybe one investor owns one parcel and another investor owns another parcel, but it still functions together. So that would be the rationale.
Okay. And then, so if I understand the tool correctly, the designer or developer dictates the number of parking spaces that's required through like an intent narrative or a parking statement, as you called it. Done. Is that it?
Not necessarily. So a pre-application meeting is required for any project that comes into the CCT. As part of that, they would need to have a preliminary proposal for their parking. And there's certain items and information that must be included in that parking statement. So it's things like how close are you to transit? Is there on-street parking available? Is this for low-income housing? Those are just, is there a bikeway nearby? Any of that information that can help inform how many parking spaces are appropriate. Are there uses on the property that can share parking? Like, for instance, is it an office building and an apartment building on the same site? The office building is going to use parking during the day most heavily. The residential is going to use it most heavily at night, right? So in our current code, you would be required to provide, you know, your office spaces and your residential spaces pretty separately. You can't cross count them. In some instances you can, but it's pretty limited. So in this scenario, you get to provide us that information up front so that it helps inform the decision. So it would be required at the pre-application to talk through that. And then it's also required as part of your full package submittal for the request. So a development package is what we call a site plan approval in the city. And your parking narrative would be required as part of that, and it would be reviewed by both Planning and Development Services and Transportation. And we would certainly be able to say, no, your analysis is incorrect. You need to provide more, or it's just like any other feature that we look at as part of a development proposal, where we say, do you meet the code? Yes, no. Do you need to fix it or adjust it? Yes, no. It's part of that review process.
So that pre-application meeting, are transportation people there as well? So all, everyone involved is there in the
Yes.
early conversation? And so it seems like the intent behind this then is about increasing efficiency of say, current parking uses per, according to the use or the site configuration. So I shouldn't say it out loud, but it feels like there's moments where there could be disagreement or an impasse. And so at that point, it's just the city's determination that dictates and not the design narrative.
I'm hoping that the pre-application helps to
Okay.
resolve some of those sticking points up front before a project comes in for full design parameters or has fully engineered drawings. You have some predictability after the pre-application conference, and the goal is to have the transportation department participate in that conversation in the very beginning.
Okay, thank you. And then I didn't see any specific language anywhere, but when we're developing up close to the street like this, it seems that allowing for parking in the right of way is something that should be included in this or allowed. Again, that one strip of parking can be a nice separation for pedestrians and bicycles to the street. So I would like to, it would be nice to see something about that in the code. And then again, the portion that talks about tiny homes, duplexes, this is a lower density use, I think, compared to what maybe you're trying to achieve up against the larger streets. And I couldn't help but wonder if, like, there were other areas in this where the language was clearly trying to create some protection between the street and the first floor, whatever's happening there. And I just wonder if there isn't like a minimum density idea that should be established like at the street, and then the stepping back happens very intentionally according to the neighborhood. It would be strange maybe to have tiny houses facing Speedway. And I don't know what that looks like in your code, but and then speaking of like building form, some of the design regulations feel, from my perspective, quite heavy-handed. Setting floor-to-floor heights, minimum finished floor elevation being 5 feet above a sidewalk is pretty difficult to achieve, like accessibility standards. And then the dimensions you're using for the step backs, they just seem I don't know, difficult to, like, every site is unique. And so it feels like each site is going to have a slightly different resolution. And so I wonder if, again, there wasn't more of a clear statement in this section of the code about intent, and then a requirement for designers to supply a narrative explaining how the intent was met, rather than these very strict design parameters. Uh, And then again, with the strict design parameters, when we move into the conversation that you brought up about incentives for the sort of middle scale developments, like one additional story per incentive. I don't know, that feels like a situation where people could be trying to seek out the bare minimum to get the maximum height. And so again, that one-for-one trade maybe seems a little minimal to me. Again, if we're trying to meet an overall design intent for these types of buildings, I would support something a little more explicit, like that's all. And then last, I'm just gonna say out loud, on Fourth Avenue, we have several buildings where the commercial ground floor is sat vacant for a very long time. And I think mixed-use development is a really positive step forward for our city. So perhaps in this code, there's a way to incentivize, or rather disincentivize, vacancies for this long. Like, how can we encourage a more robust occupancy right away, and so that those buildings don't sit vacant like that. And then, because we're just throwing things in about EV charging at the end of all of these lines of question, I would like to be a big proponent, and I realize that you're talking about EV charging through the lens of the larger multifamily and office buildings and things like that, but there's a pretty big issue right now with EV charging being required on sites that have ADUs on them. And so I would love if we could resolve that in a timely manner as well while we're talking about EV chargers. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lane. Commissioner Kinney, you're up. You've been waiting for a long time,
Right, yeah,
so.
the best for last. No, this is all good. I mean, everybody pretty much said a lot of the stuff that I was gonna say, but I want to thank Corin and Elisa and Nicholas and everybody else who worked on this. I know the commission has been, reviewing this and going through some brain damage tonight, just for, and over the past few days, we've been looking at this really, and you all have been doing it for almost 2 years. So thank you. This is a complicated item, and I think, at least in my time on the commission, it's probably the most complicated thing I've seen so far. And so, I'm concerned about the unintended consequences, and most of those unintended consequences, I think, are gonna be directed toward neighborhoods and residents off of the corridors. I just real briefly at the beginning of my thing I'm gonna do, I support another study session. I don't think we're gonna lose that much time in doing that, because we can always have another public hearing pretty quickly after that if we need to. And I think that based on what we've all said tonight, there's gonna be a lot of, hopefully a lot of changes that you all need to make, and that's gonna take you some time as well. So we need some time to see those. So, in no particular order, we heard this a little bit as well. I think that the draft needs more clarity on what a corridor is. It is, I think, attempted to be defined in 511(2)C, but it's not specifically defined. I think it needs to actually be put in the definition section of the UDC, that a corridor is this, and tie it to a link to the major streets and routes plan map. Because as we've heard tonight, that most people don't know what that map looks like. So one of the things that I would request to see next time are more maps. you know, less for my own personal education, but more for the members of the public who are watching this, and who might be looking at the materials. I think they would benefit from seeing the maps I mean, just the major streets and routes map, and I know it's big and you can't really see much detail because it's the whole city, but maybe, I don't know, do whatever you think is best in terms of viewability on it. And then maybe if you could also do a little bit of a geospatial analysis, show some of these corridors and show, specifically where large-scale development might be allowed by this, tool. I think people might want to see that. Question, well, I guess it's more of a comment now. It was a question at first, but I amended it. So there are some hypothetical developments that we're talking about here that if not for this tool would require rezoning, which is, you know, a site-specific public process, very similar to this one. Because of that, you know, I think for large-scale developments in particular, it might be a good idea to have neighborhood notification and a comment period, depending on what that project is. Regarding how R1 and R2 properties can use this tool, this is more of a question behind the intent. You know, why not limit this just to R1 and R2 properties that are on corridors? Why expand it to potentially other split zone sites? Is that really common? What's the intent there?
I'm sorry, Commissioner Kinney, can you clarify that question for me?
Yeah, so you allow R1 and R2 properties to use this tool under certain circumstances. The one that seems to make the most logical sense to me are R1 and R2 properties that are vacant and are on a corridor directly. But then there's also other options for those properties to use this tool, like for example, if it's a split zone site. Is that a common hypothetical, or why are we including that at all?
You're asking if the split zoning is common?
Yeah.
In Tucson? I would say yes,
Yeah.
it is actually. Commissioner Kinney, we see a lot of sites that have commercial kind of on a frontage and then R1 or R2 or MH1, like the example Lisa showed. So it is a common condition and something we've heard a lot about as a barrier to redevelopment that makes those sites very challenging to develop.
Okay.
And as I understand, that came out of feedback directly through the public process here.
Okay. So it looks like on the R1 and R2 subject, you've limited the use of it to prevent people from compiling R1 and R2 properties behind the corridor and taking over a neighborhood. Then in 511-2E, you say that adjacent sites that meet the criteria may be combined into a single site. What would be an example of a project that might use this provision?
Commissioner Kinney, that provision is just intended to say, essentially, if you have a site that's eligible next to another site that's eligible, they can develop it all in uniformity across those two sites. They both have to meet the criteria independently, but then you can combine them to make a larger development. It doesn't mean there's suddenly an exception to the rules that we've already outlined.
Okay. This kind of brings me to the next point, a drafting issue. You use the term site throughout the draft. Site, and you use it in lowercase. Site is a defined term in the UDC, capital S. I think it's the same definition as what you're going for. So take a look at the definition, and if it's the one you want, maybe capitalize that so people know what a site is. I see, there's some additional permitted uses. I don't have any particular issues with any of them except for alcoholic beverage service. It seems like you're allowing this and since it's part of this tool, you're incentivizing it in O2, O3, and C1. I'm not sure we really need to be incentivizing standalone bars. I have no problem with restaurants that have bars and bars that serve a certain amount of food, but just a bar, I'm not sure we need that. Maybe I'm missing something there. EV charging, I think it's a little awkward that we're considering that as part of this. I don't really fully understand why we're lumping them together, but since we're looking at them, I would be in support of making an exception for affordable housing projects and maybe even attainable housing projects from being required to meet these EV charging requirements. I think it's still an option. They can do it if they choose to, but I think as we've seen in the comments, it makes it more difficult for those projects work financially, and oftentimes the residents don't even use them. And then another comment on EV charging. Have we maybe consider phasing in EV charging requirements on a development, depending on the size of it? If it has, if it requires multiple EV charging stations, maybe let the project be built with half of those number of charging stations, see if there's demand. If there is demand, add them later. The incentive for contributing historic structures. So this already won't apply in HPZs. So I guess what this is talking about is contributing properties in National Register districts would be my assumption. So instead of incentivizing them to protect contributing structures, why not require them to preserve contributing properties in order to use this? I would be in support of requiring them to preserve contributing structures as opposed to just incentivizing them to do it. And then I'm not sure I'm in support of this, but I like to ask questions. Has there been any thought about rolling this out on a more limited basis, picking a part of town and putting this out as it is, or with these changes, putting it out for a year and then coming back, seeing what unintended consequences there have been, fixing them, and then rolling it out to the rest of town?
Commissioner Kenny, on that last question, we feel this actually, we kind of have done that in a way through our urban overlay district. So we have very similar regulations in terms of the framework, allowing additional height and density, reduced parking, more flexible development standards. We have that on a portion of Grant Road, about a 2-mile stretch, as well as about 2 miles of Broadway from Euclid to Country Club. So those urban overlay districts have been established. And that's actually one of the things we wanted to do with this tool, is build on those urban overlay districts, learning from those, what has worked, what hasn't, and try to apply that on a larger citywide basis. So what we were trying to do was create a citywide tool. And so some of what we've seen in those urban overlay districts that we have already. So on Grant Road, that district was established about 6 years ago. It was adopted by mayor and council. And it has had pretty limited use. It's been used by one affordable housing project used by the city. And one of the challenges we hear is that because that is not our downtown, it's not, one of the high development areas of the city, those additional steps and processes required just don't really match the market conditions on that type of corridor that is further from our city center. So we've seen projects actually develop in that corridor and choose not to use the overlay. And so instead we have, still the more auto-centric development that underlying zoning allows. So what we're trying to do with this tool is take some of those lessons and look at how can we really make this a usable tool for development so that we can incentivize the type of development we want. Again, housing, mixed use, pedestrian oriented development. So yes and no, we totally agree. It is appropriate to start on a pilot, and in a lot of ways the city has done that.
Thank you. Yeah, I understand that, and that makes sense that you have been kind of rolling this out in a phased way with other overlays. This is pretty significantly larger. I mean, I'm looking at the major streets and routes map, and there are a lot of streets. So as opposed to just rolling it out on a limited basis like that, what about the idea of a sunset, or not, maybe not a sunset, but a required look back after a year, seeing what happens and making adjustments at that point? Is that something that you all would be
Yeah, I mean,
open to?
Definitely. That's something we're trying to incorporate is reviews of code provisions, a year or two after they've been adopted. We did that with the ADU amendment. Mayor and council asked staff to do that at the time they adopted it, was do a review in 1 year, and we did that. And it was very helpful to look at what's been working, where is there room for improvement in the ADU ordinance. And that actually helped us develop some updates to the code when there was some state legislation that required us to do that. We were able to make some additional changes driven by local feedback. Same with the EV ordinance, based on what you're hearing. So that's something we're very open to, and always actually appreciate the opportunity to look at codes and see what's working, and if there's opportunity to update and make tweaks so that it's more usable.
Thank you. That's it.
Yeah, in your microphone. Yes, and then I would like to add
Yes,
something.
very quickly. My colleague to the left here's comments about Portland just reminded me that if we do have another study session on this, I'd also like to see, in addition to the major streets and routes maps and some other goodies like that, something that shows the transportation options that would be available in these areas under consideration for this type of development. Because in Portland, there's a much more robust mass transit options, and some of these corridors, for example, for biking, are just terrible. Broadway and Speedway are just terrible biking corridors, whereas there are other much better ones, and I'd like to see what the options are if the overall objective is to align this greater housing and leverage with de-emphasizing auto and emphasizing other options. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McCancy. Okay, so I echo some of the sentiment that has been shared this evening.
I have another question. My hand is still up.
I'll get to you. I see you. I would like to speak for a second, so I'll come back to you, Abriza. Just give me one
Thank
second,
you.
okay? So when it comes to this notion of flexibility and, ever-changing market dynamics and evolving housing trends, something that I don't see in here is just that, the unknowns and how do we deal with those case-by-case projects that maybe they are going to do something really cool or whatever, and they need, 5 additional feet for it or what have you. And right now, currently in there, we've given some ability to modify standards, but absolutely nothing as it relates to height. I see in here there are processes that we point to, for, a determination or compatibility review, et cetera. And I'd like us to consider some of that type of flexibility when we talk about those case-by-case basis that we don't know what's going to come. And if we are writing code that'll last for, several years, we might want to consider what that flexibility might look like moving forward. And along those lines, with the review aspect of, taking a look back at the code, not only looking back at it for unintended consequences, but also looking back at it as what isn't working. As we see, as you just mentioned, Ms. Manning, that there are a number of corridors and overlays in place right now, and we don't see the type of development that I think we would like to see as a community, that we would have why we supported those to be be approved, et cetera. And the question is why? Why, if it's not a zoning issue, if we have the tools in place, why isn't development coming? And it's more often than not, it's the risk, no one's there, we can't get it to pencil because of parking setbacks, height limitations, and really even more so now, it's the cost of development. And so every little bit that we add on from a design standpoint, we're adding an additional cost, and is the incentive meeting that cost that we're asking folks to do to really create the projects that we would like to see as a community? And I don't see that balance happening here strong enough of how do we get more of the, you know, the development community to want to do the cool things to help offset some of those things that the city might otherwise struggle with providing because of private property rights, whatever, you name it. So that's, I'd like to see more incentive-based approach here, and maybe it's looking at some of the elements that I think the Sunshine Mile includes, where if we do more sustainable features, if we do, you know, integrated parking and things of that nature, what does that might look like from an overall climate aspect, and how does that then help push the other plans that we have moving in the city here? I do have a whole markup comments, rather for the sake of time. I won't go through all of them, but I will provide it to staff just with comments, questions, etc. Some typos, maybe some opportunities for more clarity, like adding hyperlinks or just additional detail to your exhibits that you have in there. So I'll save that and just send that over to you. Globally, I feel like we really need to focus on consistency just with how this section of the code relates to other sections of the code. One thing that came out, which is silly, was use specific standard and the way it's written in other sections of the code as the way it's written here, just similar site definition, etc. And that place. I do want to thank you all. At one of the last stakeholder meetings I was at, I had noticed a discrepancy there, and we are pushing mixed use in the R2 zone. And we know from a market standpoint that retail likes, you know, 16 feet. Livability standards are looking more at 10 feet. That's a 26-foot building height. We were proposing 25. So I really appreciate the move that you guys did most recently to create a R2 dimensional standard specific for that. One thing I would like to note, while we did increase the height to 35 feet, I still don't know if that's quite enough, just based on that same logic when you look at ground floor, adding multiple stories above that. So we might consider that. And then the other thing that I would like us to see, or would like to see a consideration on, is revising the maximum number of stories in the R2 from 2 to 3. And the primary purpose for that is, while the R2 zone is largely a residential zone, there are emerging residential, single-family residential typologies that are coming on with the notion of intensifying or densifying city spaces. So we see single-family 3-story homes going in, and in this notion here, the height would allow for that 3-story building, but the story limitation would not. And so I think it would be maybe appropriate to list that as either a range of 2 to 3, or just simply leave it at 3, just to get that. That is I know it's a housing typology coming here in the region, or they're trying to. And so that's something in this notion of creating more attainable, affordable housing. That's how we might get there. In our definitions regarding the block scaled building types in our mid-rise and our high-rise, the intro of that starts it's the first 2 sentences are exactly the same, and the last 2 sentences are the only differentiating factors in between. And so I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I think it might be helpful to just clarify that definition and just think about that again globally when we introduce terminology. I think we've heard it across the commission here, that we just need to be predictable and have those definitions. So do think that through on the next section. Um, and I think that's generally, again, I have some markups that I'll send on over to staff, and I don't necessarily need to go through typos here and what have you. But I think generally, I look at this as something that the city is needed. It's a good way of achieving economies of scales. It's a good way of achieving additional housing opportunities and really fostering the development types that we, I think, as I've heard in several just public opportunities to participate in this, that's what the community wants. And I think a lot of people are very supportive of this, and we just need to make sure that it's abundantly clear what it is we're trying to achieve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abriza, and then we'll move on from this.
Right, thanks. Again, this has been a good year, and this presentation cleared a lot of things up. There was a lot of material to go through. Thank you all for all that, and thank you all for all the comments. A few things got clarified in the course of me raising my hand, but it's the same question. It's a little personal item that I do understand that the UDC laws have that there have to be persons with disability ADA compliant buildings, and I believe that Commissioner Glaston actually brought that up. And is there in the UDC, is there actually a clause when you're putting in a 3-story, you're talking 7, 8-story building apartment complex, that there are requirements for elevators, that the doors are wider, that there are actually will be available for occupancy for people who need that extra ADA compliant facilities. Also, I think it's eliminating the input from the neighbors that will be affected by this, whether they're in single family homes or they're in duplexes or in a condominium or something like that, to then have even stepped stories going 4 to 6 stories is going to be a difficult thing for neighborhoods to actually accept. Maybe a little gentler touch with this might be appropriate. I'm not sure if when the corridors are better explained, is maybe along the feeder streets, I think that's what you can also call them, that rather than the main arteries, is keep those, to 2, 3 stories at the max, and not have, a 7-story complex go along one of these smaller streets. And that's it. All my other comments and questions have been voiced by other folks, and thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Zagier. Ms. Hamlin?
Commissioner Zagier, I'd just like to offer a point of clarification on your questions about ADA requirements. Those are regulated by the building code as far as how a building is constructed, size of doorways, elevators, all of those things. So the zoning code would not override the building code in that instance. There are some site features, like size of a sidewalk or a ramp on a sidewalk, that we look at as part of the site development, but the rest of it would be looked at during the building review and compliance for the building code.
Thank you.
Commissioner Martin.
So, forgive me for my rambling, because of the short fuse on this. I wanted to make sure that my comments were on the record. You know, we didn't get the revised draft till Thursday afternoon. And I'm retired or semi-retired, so I had time to review it, but, I agree that having another study session would be good so we can see a revised draft, because all the commissioners brought up points they'd like to see and changes or discussion why it can't be changed. So thank you for your time. Thank you for all your hard work too.
So is there any other discussion? So with the completion of the discussion, I'm going to open up for a motion.
So I'll make a motion and then we can talk about it. I'll move that we continue this agenda item for another study session in January, I suppose, would be the next time.
Excuse me, I have my hand up.
Excuse me, ma'am, this is not a public hearing, so at this time, your opportunity to speak is during the call to the audience on this. So we'll get there and I see your hand up and I'll call on you and you can speak on this item here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
So we have a motion, I guess, maybe if we could discuss with staff to see if January is feasible for them to meet a desired study session.
Yes, that's perfectly acceptable. We can use the same date that was proposed by staff for the public hearing of January 15th. I will just add as well for the commission that you saw a number of public comments already on this item before it reached a public hearing. So there is a lot of interest in our community in commenting on this item. So I just want to note that you also have the option to continue a public hearing once you open a public hearing.
Correct. So we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of continuing this item for a study session on January 15th, 2025, say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Nay. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that means motion pass. Roll call? Roll call.
Thank you. Yes. Commissioner Kenny,
Aye.
Commissioner Lampo,
Aye.
Commissioner Lane,
No.
Commissioner McCancy,
Aye.
Commissioner Martin,
Aye.
Commissioner Schwartz, and, Commissioner Small,
Aye.
Commissioner Walzak,
No.
Chair Willett,
No.
Commissioner Young,
Young.
Commissioner Zagier.
Aye.
We
Ziggy.
have 6 yes and 4 no.
So what does that mean?
Motion.
So motion passes. So then that means we will set for another study session then on January 15th. Before we move on to the next item, I would like to ask the commission, do you guys need a potty break? Because we've been going for about 2.5 hours and I know I need to go potty. So if we could just take a really quick, really brief 5 minutes, we'll be back here in
No.
at 8:50. prompt. You got it? Very good. Thanks, friends. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started on the next item. But before we do so, thanks to the commission for the really robust conversation here. I think that's how we get where we want to be. So with that, we're going to call the next item number 4, which is the Plan Tucson 2025 study session. Would staff please provide their presentation?
Great. Good evening, commissioners. Thank you so much for sticking with me. My name is Cesar Acosta. I'm a principal planner with Planning and Development Services. I'm project manager on Plan Tucson. We're very excited today to present to you our first look at the preliminary draft of Plan Tucson 2025. So just a little refresher, a general plan is a state-required long-range planning document. It's intended to cover a wide range of topics, including land use distribution, planning for transportation and circulation, open space, air and water quality, housing needs, safety, and a number of other topics. Tonight's discussion is intended to go over our update process of how we got to where we are today, an overview of what's in the draft Plan Tucson 2025, and then next steps for both our opportunities for engagement with the public and what we hope to meet with y'all later. So our story begins back in November of 2022 when City Council and Mayor directed staff to begin the update process of our current general plan that was passed in 2013. And this has been about a 3-year process that we've broken up into 4 phases. We are now in the beginning of phase 3, where we have our first draft and are talking to the public. In our first phase, which began December of 2022, we really were trying to reach out to a broad stretch of the public to gain what were the core values, desires, and needs of the community. We had 3 main questions that we were asking. What do you like about Tucson? What are you concerned about in Tucson? And what do you want to see change over the next 10 years? So these were broad-based questions, and we reached out to the public in a variety of manners, including in-person, virtual opportunities, and just walking to people with clipboards. All totaled, we hit about 2,000 individuals, received over 950 responses to surveys, 400 plus online, and had 13,000 individual pieces of engagement, which helped us really form what the core themes and ideas for our next phase of the plan would be. And so with that data, we focused into 5 main themes of discussion: community resources, economic vitality, land use, housing, neighborhood design, water, climate action, green space, and transportation, mobility, and access. And these 5 themes were working groups. So we invited members of the public to meet with us, not just once, but over the course of several months. 18 working groups in total, some virtual, some in person. These were during work hours, during the weekday. So these 2-hour-long discussions were not accessible to all members of the public. So to make sure that we touched on everyone in the community, we also held 6 community forums, which were on weekend and evening hours, both virtual and in person. In this stage, we spoke with around 655 unique individuals. And even though that was fewer than phase 1, the level of detail of engagement that we received from the public was much richer and went into a great detail of the kind of goals that we should have for the city over the next 10 years, what should be the policies and strategies to achieve those goals, and what should the organization of our document look like. And so again, the types of engagement we had were broad-based. We met with people in these working group sessions that I described, as well as in-person events, virtual workshops. We're at pop-up events that were at the Tucson Festival of Books, Tucson Meet Yourself, and a number of other important community events where we could just have a booth to talk to people about what Plan Tucson is and how they could be involved. We met with different departments and boards and commissions, as well as worked internally with staff across the city organization. And after a 1.5 years of continuous public engagement, we had 20 goals, 328 plus policies, and a few thousand comments of what should be included to reflect the document for our vision statement, which is asking really what kind of city do we want to be over the next 10 years. So we took that information and crafted into our first draft of goals and policies. And over the summer of this year, we set up office hours in each ward and with the mayor's office and a couple of virtual opportunities to ask folks, what do they think? Is this heading in the right direction? And the feedback that we got consistently back was this is good, but a bit overwhelming. And we're having a hard time wrapping our head around this many policies. The goals seem to be a bit repetitive. So we went back and started to revise, merge, and get our goals into something that was more concise and more distinct. And it was also a chance to check in with our interdepartmental work to make sure that the goals and policies that we had drafted were consistent with the projects and work that each of the individual departments in the city organization were doing, so that we are not only supporting the work that they're doing, but what they want to be achieving over the next 10 years. We then sent it to city manager's office, where they were able to get their perspective on if this draft would help to move the city forward and if it was cohesive from their perspective, and they agreed with some few minor tweaks, which allowed us to publish our first draft of this document yesterday. So what's in the plan? It's broken up into 5 chapters. The first chapter really is just an orientation to what the plan is, what's the purpose of a general plan, how it relates to other planning documents, functional plans, small area neighborhood plans. What was the process for engagement that I just described to you in greater detail, as well as some of the guiding principles that we used when working with the public. Chapter 2 focuses on just giving a reflection of what the city is like. So a brief history from our earliest indigenous origins all the way to current state, and then a bit of our current conditions. So what are the current demographics, population, economy, and current development trends that we see in Tucson today, as well as a discussion on how neighborhoods interact with not only the planning process, but with the city overall, to continue interacting and make sure that we're reflective of the community's desires in all of our processes. Chapter 3 is really where the bulk of the document starts. That's our goals and policies. I'm going to go through a brief overview of the 14 goals we have, and just to say that each of them has a set number of policies geared towards helping achieving those goals, but a lot of the policies appear in multiple goals, just to illustrate the interrelated nature of each of these aspects. Goals that help housing, help impact transportation, which help impact health and safety, and so that's illustrated throughout the document. And so those are our 14 goals. Again, each of them touch on a specific and distinct aspect of our community's interest, and what we heard from them is what's important to make sure we're moving forward and promoting in the next decade. Goal 1 is to foster inclusive, transparent, efficient, and equitable city governance. We worked with all departments to make sure that our goals were working with what their initiatives are working to achieve, but we worked more closely with the ward offices, the Office of Equity, and the city clerk's office for this particular goal. Policies are aimed at making sure that we're removing barriers to public participation and involvement, and also making sure that the general public and stakeholders have easy access to all the documents and resources that the city provides. Goal 2, support the development of an equitable community, looks at how we can think intentionally about city resources and how we're making sure that they're distributed throughout the entire city and meeting the needs of specific communities at all times. We work closely with the Office of Equity, Housing Community Development, Department of Transportation Mobility, and Community Safety, Health, and Wellness Program. Goal 3, be a leader in carbon reduction and resiliency to extreme heat and climate impacts. We work closely with the city manager's office, with their chief resiliency officer, the Department of Environmental and General Services, Department of Transportation Mobility, and Planning and Development Services, our own shop. And policies here focus on how we think about energy, both how we're encouraging energy production and energy use in the city. Goal 4, improve health, wellness, and safety across the community. We worked with a number of departments because this one really does think about how there's an interrelation between safety and health. And so policies focused here on how we can promote healthier, safer spaces, as well as directing resources to make sure that we're promoting better quality of life, physical health, social health, and mental health. Goal 5, expand affordable and accessible housing options. Work closely with Housing Community Development, Office of Equity, Community Health, Safety, Health, and Wellness Program, and Planning and Development Services. Policies here focused on how we're making sure that we're providing housing, or all types of housing, for all levels of income and all parts of the city. So that was the primary goal here. Goal 6, expand access to quality education for all ages and abilities. We work closely with the Parks and Rec Department because even though the city does not directly work with the schools, we provide the environment for lifelong learning. So we have a lot of programs dedicated to continued learning as well as workforce development. And so the policies here focus on how do we make sure to provide access to those services. Goal 7 is promote the responsible management of use of water. So we work closely with Tucson Water and within Planning Development Services. Planning policy here really was focused on making sure that we continue the work we have for water, for quality of water, water use, as well as making sure that we're providing access to education for our residents, that water programs can be best used and that best practices for water resources are used throughout the community. Goal 8 is promote a clean community and reduce the harmful effects of pollutants in the environment. So we work closely with the EGSD, the city manager's office, and within planning development services to look at policies that could focus on how we reduce not just waste, but also better resources, better resource management, and then reduce light pollution, noise pollution, and think about how we can better clean up the spaces around the city as well. Goal 9, preserve, protect, and enhance natural ecosystems and open spaces, looks at how we are becoming better stewards of the land, not just the open spaces within the city, but possibility for acquisition of land that can preserve more open space. And then just how we're making sure to preserve washes and our riparian areas to make sure that we're preserving the environment of these important ecosystems and how they affect our city. We work closely with the city manager's office, Tucson Water, Parks and Rec, Development Services, and Transportation and Mobility on this goal. For Goal 10, preserve and protect the city's unique historic and archaeological resources. We work with the city manager's office and as well as the mayor's office who are working on the Somos Unos project. So for cultural resources to make sure that the general plan is in line with that project. Policies here really are focused on trying to make sure that we're celebrating and promoting all of the great cultural resources that the city has, including our UNESCO Gastro City designation and how we can promote that here, both within the city and within the region and state. Goal 11 for Tucson's arts and culture. I think I just got mixed up, so that was that's the work that we're doing with that. And goal 10, I'm gonna go back, focuses on how we're doing work for historic preservation of our sites, structures, and locations that includes within our historic preservation zones as well as within designated historic sites in the city. My apologies for mixing those up, y'all. Goal 12 is strengthen the local and regional economy to provide opportunities for all Tucsonans to thrive. We worked closely with our Office of Economic Initiatives and their document SEDS, that's the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, to make sure that this plan, that our general plan aligns with those goals to strengthen our local and regional economy. How do we focus on improving local and legacy businesses to make sure that they have opportunities to grow and thrive, as well as how we're promoting tourism and inviting greater investment for new jobs to come to Tucson. Goal 13, expand access to high quality transportation choices, enhance safety, and improve the conditions of other infrastructure. Work closely with transportation mobility as well as development services to think about how policies can work to better enhance our access to mobility options across the city, while also making sure that safety is a key component for all modes of transportation across Tucson. Lastly, goal 14 is ensure comprehensive and inclusive land use planning for a well-designed and vibrant community. Again, work with a number of departments to make sure that we're thinking comprehensively about land use. So for all of the various overlays, city plans, and documents that we have, that new developments work to incorporate all these aspects and think about how they are intentionally developed for any changes or revisions that they do and any new developments that they work together. And this includes not only the city documents, but ones with the county as well as regional plans. So that's where we have our goals and policies. Chapter 4 focuses on future growth. So this is where we house our future growth scenario map, as well as our development guidelines and future land uses known as building blocks. So this chapter goes into a discussion of how we developed each of those and provides context of our current population growth and trends, as well as development trends over the last 10 years that helped guide some of the decisions for where our growth map is. The growth map presented within this first draft is actually the second draft, but third iteration of the development of the future growth scenario map. The first version of this looked at what our 2013 growth map was and overlaid it with growth trends over the last 10 years and then shaped accordingly. Then we presented it to the public for a first round of questions to see where do you want to see more growth, less growth, where do we think we got it right? And that produced our the second draft that we have, which now we're going to ask the public, is this the kind of character that you want to see in Tucson and in the places where you want to see it? Each of those colors represents a building block. Building block are future land uses, not to be confused with zoning, in that they are not prescriptive, merely intended to be guidance for the kind of character we want to see developed in Tucson over the next 10 years. So each of those building blocks has a specific character associated with them, with the different mix of housing and commercial uses based on levels of intensity, as well as the kind of transportation infrastructure that interacts with those land uses. So this is within the general plan. If you go to chapter 4, has a table that shows you some of the general attributes as well as examples of the kinds of locations with that these building blocks envision. But all of them include a mix of uses, so all of them include some residential and some commercial at varying levels. And so those are some of the additional ones for business centers, industrial spaces. We also have a description for what are called special planning areas. So these are not building blocks, but rather areas where we have set policies in place for more specific types of development to go in place, whether they be pads or larger master plan developments within the Southlands and along the Houghton corridor in particular. Lastly, chapter 5 is implementation. So here we talk about the tools used for implementation. We really want to make sure that all of the functional plans, thinking of HAST or PCHIP or Tucson Resilient Together, as the mechanisms to really implement the goals of the general plan, since they have the more specific timelines and locations for where different policies can be implemented. It also includes a list of the long-term, near, mid, and long-term projects the city is working on that help to implement some of the various goals described in Chapter 3, as a way to kind of give concrete examples of how we're moving forward with achieving the vision the community's asked us to implement. Lastly, there's a discussion on how changes to the general plan can be made and how the general plan interacts with the functional and small and area plans that already exist. So that's a brief overview of what the general plan has. It's a 300-page document, and we know that you need a lot more time than just a brief overview to go over it. But next steps for this include coming back to the public in January to get their opinion on it. From now through January 20th, we're going to open an engagement period where we have a number of virtual and in-person opportunities to speak with us. For folks who do not have the opportunity to come to any of those events, our website also includes some online surveys for people to give us feedback individually and at their own time. We also have a tool called Meeting in a Box, which is a way for the public to gather, and there's resources provided for them to have their own meeting, but it provides resources for them to be able to give the same kind of feedback that we would be asking for at any of our events. So we're really excited to provide the public as many opportunities as possible to engage with us on this first draft. For y'all, we're hoping to come back to you at another study session. That's a proposed date, but we're very flexible. So just sometime in January, we want to be able to come back to you and tell you what the public has told us and some of the potential changes that we would put into a revised draft. And then in late February, early March, we would like to come to you for public hearings, which are required under state law. We need at least a minimum of 2. They would be hybrid. One would be here, and then another would be off location to provide additional chances for public engagement. And that would be a revised draft that we'd be able to present to you then. Per your recommendation, we would then go to Mayor and Council, hopefully in sometime in late April, early May, for them to give us a vote of ratification to be able to put this on the ballot. And ultimately, this goes to the voters in November of next year. So that's our long timeline for where we're at. So again, I moved through that pretty quick, but I think you won't mind about that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have at this time. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Cesar. Really appreciate the presentation. Are there any questions at this time for staff? Commissioner McCancy?
Just real quick, how would you go about doing that, feedback in a box or whatever that was?
Yeah, absolutely. So really do encourage everyone to check out our webpage. We actually did several iterations of it to make sure that it was easy to understand. So if you go to our website, there's instructions for how to run your own meeting. There's facilitator note instructions, there's note taker note instructions, and then a couple of videos that tell you how to run the meeting and what kind of feedback we're asking for. If you are unable to access the internet or just prefer to do things in an analog method, we've sent printed copies of all of our materials to each ward office. So every ward office has 2 copies of the printed materials for Meeting in a Box. And these are intended to be for any neighborhood association or any community interest group or just a group of friends to gather around and give the feedback.
Thanks, Commissioner McCancy. Commissioner Zagier, I see your hand up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I didn't notice, I could have missed it reading through it, but is there any mention in Plan Tucson as far as our crumbling infrastructure maintenance? As far as, is that in the planning, or we just continue to just build and move out and plan without, like, well, let's just go back to our streets are in poor condition. So is there anything in Plan Tucson to address some of those infrastructure problems?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. And actually, yes. So a large amount of discussions in phase 2 were about how do we make sure that we're not just expanding development, but maintaining. So many of our policies for land use and our transportation goal, as well as historic preservation and housing goals, use the word maintain. So develop and maintain, grow and maintain. And a number of parts of our narrative discuss how we're making sure to reuse resources as well. So part of our sustainability goals are to make sure that we're thinking of ways to be intentional about the materials that we have so that we're not just demolishing, but reusing material as well. So in a number of different sections of different goals, we're working on making sure that we're maintaining and continuing to enforce our existing infrastructure and housing.
Okay, so that it not only includes maintaining new structure, but the current existing structure of bridges, washes, and such.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any other questions for staff? Commissioner Walzak?
I'm just curious when the election will be held. There's a number of elections happening next year.
Sure. So this, thank you for the question, Commissioner. Like, this is intended to be for the November 4th election, I believe. And that is partly why we want to make sure to keep a timeline that allows us to get to public hearings to y'all in February and March to make sure that we can get this to council in time for materials to go out in for city clerk.
Thank you. Any other questions? Very good. Thank you, Cesar, and thanks to all you and your team for all the hard work that you guys have been doing on this. That brings us to item number 5, PDSD staff announcements. Would staff please provide any updates to the commission?
No updates. You guys have gotten a lot of information tonight on really our key initiatives at the moment, the community corridors tool and Plan Tucson. I just really want to thank you all for the feedback. It was a really productive meeting for staff and really helpful to get such robust feedback from Planning Commission. So we will be doing some work on that proposal over the next few weeks, and we'll come back to you in January. We may be polling you guys on some potential additional meeting dates. And I think we have to also send you a series of appointments for 2025. But just know that due to mayor and council meetings that sometimes alternate from their regular schedule, and then also just, the number of items and trying to balance the number of meetings over January, February, and March, we may be polling you on your availability for some additional meeting dates. As you can tell, it's going to be a busy first quarter of 2025 in terms of planning initiatives that we are working on. And we really just, again, appreciate the work and the time that you all put into participating on this commission and doing so thoughtfully. Thank you.
So that brings us to future agenda items. I think you've already handled what we will be moving into the future, so we'll go ahead and move on unless you have something else to add there. That brings us to the last item here before adjournment, and that is item number 7, call to the audience. At this time, I would like to offer the public an opportunity to speak on any subject that is not listed on the current agenda as a public hearing. I do have a few speakers who have asked both via email and in person, but Ms. Glaston, you've had your hand up for about 2.5 hours now, and so I want to start with you. You are free to speak at this time.
Kind of you. Thank you very much. One of the first questions I had, I very much interested in affordable housing. The first question I have though, I live in the Blenman Elm neighborhood, and I'm wondering, has the historic preservation officer position been filled yet for the city of Tucson to represent us?
Chair Willett, members of the commission, no, but we have a recruitment underway right now, actually, for historic preservation officer. So I expect that position to be filled in the next month or so.
Okay, so I'm hopeful that that position will be filled and that'll be somebody who can speak on behalf of the historic neighborhoods. The other thing is I noticed that some of the photographs that were shown for affordable housing included things like the Baffert at 5 Points. And as far as I know, the Baffert is not really an affordable housing building. Currently, they have 2 available apartments under 700 square feet that are 1 bedroom, 1 bath, that are renting between $1,500 and $1,580. And I personally don't consider that affordable housing. Likewise with the Mercado, I'm not sure what's affordable there. The last thing I saw that was available on Zillow was in the millions of dollars. So I'm a little bit concerned about that in showing different kinds of developments that will be affordable housing. And I want to make sure that they actually are. And that kind of relates to some of the ADU changes that were made in the neighborhoods. We have not seen affordable housing being built in Blenman. In fact, just on my block, we had a house that was flipped, and what they're calling an ADU was formerly a shed, but they're calling it a bedroom now. That house is being rented for $4,800 a month. So we know that those kinds of things are not affordable. And I just want to make sure that when we talk about affordable housing, that we're actually talking about affordable. I've also been working with the Blenman Elementary School, and I know that most of the students who attend the school in the project that I'm working with in the 5th grade come from 3 apartment complexes in the area. And those, I think, are affordable housing. So if we can make sure that those kinds of things, I know that because of the state regulations, we can't require developers to have affordable housing. But I'm very concerned about that for families, because I just don't feel that what has been called affordable housing is actually happening. Let's see, the other things, I'm pleased to hear that there's sort of a slowing down, that there's a request for more time for study sessions, and especially with now Plan Tucson saying that they really won't have all their information until January 20th. I think all that should be worked together. And I'm just wondering if there is incentive-based development, like what can we offer developers to actually have affordable housing? I think that there are some things that we can do regarding that. And as we move forward on collector streets and other streets like that, it's really important to involve the school districts. For example, on Pima at Country Club, I believe Country Club would be a collector street. I don't know. I know Pima would be certainly, even though it looks like that's probably blocked out because there's mostly residential housing there. But for example, we lost a crossing guard there. There are kids hanging out in the morning at 8 o'clock in the morning that are afraid to cross Pima because there's no crossing guard there any longer. And that's a problem. So I think all that traffic mitigation should also be considered as far as when we go ahead with these kinds of things. And let's see, the last thing I wanted to address, I just want to make sure that as far as infrastructure goes, I heard someone talk about water, but I just don't know about is electric besides Tucson Water for your goal number 7. Is everybody on board with that? How much infrastructure are we actually going to need in order to put up these kinds of buildings, especially if they're 2 and 3 stories? It's definitely going to be a concern. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and we appreciate your comments here.
Thank you.
The next I have on the list is Logan Havens.
All right. My name is Logan Havens. I'm unpaid speaker, just here as a community member. I was the president of Feldman's Neighborhood Association. Other than that, I'm just a person. A couple of answers to Hannah's questions. I'm a professional photographer. I photograph both private projects for developers, residential projects for individuals, as well as mostly affordable housing projects in the city. I am car free. I don't own a vehicle. I do rent cars and drive through the city. However, I have biked from the Newport on Rodeo that was just built up to most of those affordable housing projects. For your information, in the Mercado district, there is a whole building dedicated to affordable housing. There is a whole building dedicated to senior affordable housing. There are 2 row homes within the single family district that are rentals for affordable housing. So as a proportion of neighborhood having some of the highest market rates in the city, it does have quite a bit of affordable housing. I think it is showing both some of those like Newport at Rodeo where some of the photographs, some of those affordable housing buildings look nicer than we're expecting. Sometimes we don't expect that affordable housing should have dignity. I think that sometimes we are able to accomplish it where it does fit in with the neighborhood of our character. So, and then what I really wanted to talk about, I had different comments, but then coming in here as a homeowner with privilege of having bought before the pandemic when prices were different. When we're talking about the unintended consequences or slowing this process, that is coming from a space that I believe the majority of us who have the freedom and time to be here this late at night are homeowners who are stable in our housing and in our lives. So when we're talking about the discomfort that we might experience as homeowners of how these apartments will encroach on our neighborhoods, I just wanted to make sure that there was a voice in the room saying that the unintended consequences that have existed from the last 6 years, especially till now, has been an increase in unhoused population. I ride my bicycle on the loop regularly. There are points where I cannot cross under the under Grant or under Speedway because there are 30 people finding housing underneath that bridge. So while we're watching my neighbors across the street that are renters have their rents increase from around $500 to around $1,500, that unintended consequence is those people having to move. One woman is a teacher at the school for the blind who took transit to her job that was on Speedway, and she was leaving Feldman's. Now she had to move several miles north because the property is too expensive for her. So she's having to move further out where she's having to take multiple bus connections to get her job working at a school for the blind. So as we're considering these unintended consequences and slowing the process to make sure that we as homeowners are comfortable and that we are that this 2-story buffer behind us isn't going to affect our comfort levels or our expectations or what we want from the value of our property. I do think we need to think about all of the people in the city who aren't represented in these meetings, who don't have the socioeconomics, the time, the education, or the emotional space to be here. I would like to applaud planning and development or commend you. This is a very thoughtful, beautiful plan. I think that there are things that can be fixed through sunset provisions or through work up until the time that it's adopted. Then as a homeowner, the unintended consequences is that I was president of the Feldman's Neighborhood Association. And when I became that president of the neighborhood association, that was when one of the photographs of the unintended bad development style is that Starbucks on Speedway and 6th Avenue. And I was told that because of that was a standard development package, we had no feedback on that development. So we get in between West University and Feldman's neighborhood, 2 historic, dense, urban downtown neighborhoods with a 30-minute walk to the city center. We're getting drive-throughs with multiple driveway aprons leading you through this drive-through. And the safety for me moving down 6th Avenue, walking or bicycling or driving is less safe with people veering in to get their morning frappuccino. And then as this process has continued, now the parcel across the street on 6th Avenue and Speedway is now becoming another drive-through coffee shop. I'm tired of seeing Starbucks after Dunkin' Donuts after all of these. These are fitting within our development pattern. They get no neighborhood feedback. I would like to have it where instead of that unintended consequence, the unintended consequence is we get marginally more housing to hopefully address some of this. The reality is Phoenix is outpacing us with affordability. Portland, we brought up that example, has seen a decrease in rent prices. If you look up a walkable neighborhood like Alberta next to an Alberta co-op and a commercial corridor and multiple grocers, rents there are around $1,200 for a brand new apartment. That comes from supply, that comes from volume, that comes from building out an infrastructure of builders and developers who can make larger amounts of housing in our neighborhoods. And the Baffert at $1,500, I have friends living in that neighborhood that can't find housing for under $1,400. So $1,500 for a brand new build, it's not affordable, but it is more units in that neighborhood that is already dramatically more expensive than that. So those are a lot of ideas, but I would just say, like, as we're approaching this, please consider that we have a large percentage of our population that doesn't sit in the comfort of a home, that might be even completely paid off, that they have no mortgages. These are people that when that rent goes up $100, they get pushed into the loop, living unhoused, lighting fires, burning plastics to stay warm at night. So thank you for your time. I appreciate your consideration. I appreciate that you all volunteer on this. It is a really late night. So thank you for your comments and for reading through it and having a lot of the comments. So I hope we're able to come to a reasonable plan that can improve our city.
Thank you, Mr. Havens. Next on the list, I have Lois Pollock. Lois, are you still on the line? I see you're on the line. Oh,
Yeah.
there she is.
Okay, great. Hey, I am president of Garden District Neighborhood. We are a grant to Speedway, Alvernon to Swan, 3,500 households, 7,000 residents. Our collector streets are full of residences, and we cannot advocate for more density on the collectors. We have an incredibly high walking population, very little infrastructure, very few sidewalks in the neighborhood. We've already got the Grant Road widening, driving all the traffic down on these collectors. We are we're very worried about adding any more density on these collectors. We are all for, trying to improve the housing and the amount of housing and everything. So it's not that. It's that each neighborhood needs to have their needs considered. Each neighborhood is a different character, but they're a different makeup. We don't have alleys. I have 2 streets in the neighborhood that maybe a block long that have an alley. I've got R2 that backs up to the Grant Road where they just demolished, everything for the widening. And now those are in threat of maybe being developed into larger high-rise that will be right across the street now from R1 homes. R2 was sold originally to the residents as an advantage. You could put a second home on the property and things like that, maybe make a little bit of extra rental income. But now they've turned into bad rentals. We're plagued with out-of-town landlords on the vast majority of our rental property, and we are 73% rental in that 1 square mile. So our biggest concerns are more rentals equal more problems, because people in rentals don't know they belong to neighborhood associations. The landlords don't care. And I would say basically, if you are a mom and pop rental, you know, you own a few complexes, you know, that are small, great. But the other people, they do it for the income, just the that's all there is to it. It's all about money. And so I've got one at the corner of Pima and Columbus. And that, I can't figure out what's going on with that property, but it has changed hands about every 2 to 3 years. And it always says under new management, under renovation. We've approached each of the management companies there to try and get them to work with the neighborhood, to clean things up, pick up the garbage, whatever the problems are. And they all just refuse to do it. So that's what we're dreading. You know, like I said, we have no problem adding density, but it needs to be something that will work in the neighborhood. And we would hope that it would bring people who would want to belong to the neighborhood. But I've been the president now for over 10 years, and I've lived in Tucson for over 35 years, and it doesn't work that way. So, you know, this tool is going to bring some, you know, consequences to everybody. The one thing that we are all disturbed about as neighborhood people is the feedback from the public that has been collected. It's our understanding after reading the statistics about how many people have attended the public meetings for the tool and how many have provided feedback, that there's only been, and I'm going to be generous, about 300 responses. 300 responses from the public out of a city of 550,000 people is not what the city is calling robust feedback. That's got to be the biggest concern that we all have. If we're going to do this mass rezoning, we certainly need a mass amount of people to be giving feedback on it. And I totally sympathize with the people who said that, the commissioners who have said they didn't have time to read it. Well, you know what? A lot of the commissioners, and maybe all of them, you have experience with the zoning codes and how to read the language and all of the definitions. But the layperson cannot go through a 361-page document and really make any sense out of it. And we see things in there that are disturbing, like, and it seems like as the code has evolved, they've thrown in the kitchen sink in some respects. I've got multiple trailer parks, for instance, 3 of which border on Columbus, 1 borders on Pima. And now it looks like those could be pretty much can use this tool, so they could be replaced. Those are the cheapest rental properties in the neighborhood now that people could actually afford to live in. And it's disturbing to see that this tool potentially wipes out the last of my affordable housing. And we get calls periodically from people, what can I do? Another investor.
Ms. Pollock, would you mind wrapping up your
Yeah.
thoughts here so we can get on to the next speaker?
Sure. And so my point is, one size zoning does not fit all neighborhoods, and that this needs to be taken piece by piece. Go to neighborhoods who want to have it. Try and do some development in there. See if that works. Move on to another neighborhood. Ask for volunteer neighborhoods if they want to do it. And we want the public process back in these projects. Nobody wants to wake up tomorrow and find out there's going to be a 6-story apartment building built on the other side of the street from them, and they had no recourse whatsoever. So that's really disappointing. to see that that's been taken. So anyhow, those are my main points, and I've got tons of other ones, but I've written a letter. A lot of us have written letters to the Planning Commission, and we really appreciate your review of our letters and our concerns because they reflect a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the list, I have Gail Hartman. Miss Hartman, are you on the call? I do not see her name, so. Okay, well, we'll come back. Last on the list, it would be Molly McCassin. Is Miss McCassin on the line? All right, so we've got Molly or Gail Hartman. Any takers? Okay, are there any other members of the public who are online who would like to speak? If so, please start speaking. All right, is there anybody else in the audience that would like to speak? Oh, it looks like Colette.
Yes, that's me. So I'm just going to give you a perspective on affordable housing. I sit on the board of a HUD 202. So we provide housing for extremely low income seniors. And the perspective that I have, at least for extremely low income housing, is that you run into a wall come about year 15 when all of your infrastructure starts to fail and HUD does not provide you with enough money to fix that infrastructure. And so one of the issues on affordable housing is it's great to build more, but we also have to factor in that somewhere down the road, you have to start repairing and replacing a lot of expensive systems that can run you close to $1 million. And so there's nothing in this corridor tools that actually helps to preserve housing. As part of my service, I actually talked to a developer who builds light-tech housing because I wanted to figure out why is it that developers don't want to put affordable housing into their projects. And his perspective is that there's multiple problems, but one of them is that you have to have two business plans. You have to have the business plan for your workforce housing or your market rate housing, and then you have to have a separate one that runs under different rules and regulations for the affordable units, and that developers do not see this as profitable. And so the idea that we're going to be able to provide incentives really doesn't work. And so it's like we have to take a very different approach to this. And the biggest approach is, one, we need to see about trying to preserve the housing that's already there, not lose any housing and not lose ground. And that's a big factor that the city can actually be involved in, that I wish they would be more closely involved in, because it does take money to keep these buildings up and running and not lose them. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members who would like to speak at this time? Very good. Hearing none, let's go ahead and move on to item number 8, adjournment. Yeah.
I motion we adjourn.
Sorry, just want to remind the commissioners that Lexi's term is up next month. So get your campaigns going.
It's going to be a stiff race, I can tell you.
So just a reminder that.
And it can't be Chuck this next go around because Chuck is leaving us this next year. So do keep that in mind. Elections will be held in January. So if you are interested, be ready to nominate yourself. Well, with that, thank you all so much. If we don't talk to you before then, between now and then, I hope you all have a wonderful holiday and a happy new year. And thanks